Tonight, I want to tell you about the Sith, and specifically about how a single man, alone and hunted and half-broken, spent 1,000 years reshaping darkness itself into something the galaxy would never see coming. It is the beginning of a story that moves in shadow, slowly, patiently, across centuries. A story about how evil can be made systematic, how it can be made rational, and how that rationality makes it far more dangerous than any moment of rage or hunger ever could. You know the Jedi, or you will soon, the way they move through the galaxy with lightsabers and robes, the guardians of peace, the keepers of light. But before them, underneath them, running beneath the entire history of the Old Republic like an underground river, there was darkness. And this is how that darkness learned to hide. The end of the Sith, as far as the Jedi and the Republic believed, came at a place called Ruusan, in a terrible battle that was neither a beginning nor quite an ending, but something closer to a burial. On that scarred world, a Jedi general named Lord Hoth led what was called the Army of Light against the last great Sith Order, a sprawling, ambitious confederation called the Brotherhood of Darkness. The Brotherhood was led by a Sith Lord named Skir Khan, a man who had gathered hundreds of dark side users beneath him, a great pulsing organism of power that seemed, in that moment, unstoppable. But what looked like strength from the outside was already becoming weakness from within, and that weakness was no accident. Among the ranks of that brotherhood was a man who had once been called Dissel, a human born on a mining world named Apatros, who had clawed his way up from the Cortosis mines into the Sith academies, who had studied the old ways, and who had come to see something that almost no one else could see. He saw that the Brotherhood was eating itself. He saw that Khan's vision of power distributed among many was a vision of diluted strength, that 100 Sith competing for dominance and resources and the dark side's favor could never be as strong as a single Sith disciplined enough to stand alone. This man, who had taken the name Darth Bane, did something that would reshape the course of all that followed. In the final moments of the Battle of Ruusan, with the Jedi closing in and defeat becoming inevitable, Bane whispered a suggestion in Khan's ear. Use the ultimate weapon, the Thought Bomb, a Force artifact so terrible that it would obliterate everything it touched, Sith and Jedi alike, friend and foe, in an instant of annihilation. Khan, desperate and grieving, detonated it. The thought bomb unraveled every mind within its radius, erasing consciousness itself, killing hundreds upon hundreds in a single act of cosmic violence so absolute that even the Force itself recoiled from it. And when the light faded and the survivors began to emerge from the wreckage, there was one man standing who should not have been standing. Darth Bane had known it was coming. He had positioned himself just outside the weapon's reach, and he had lived. Around him lay the grave of the entire Brotherhood of Darkness, every rival, every competing voice, every Sith Lord who might have challenged him or divided his vision or scattered the dark side's power across factions and ambitions. The Jedi took their victory, believed the Sith were extinct, reorganized their order and their republic in the aftermath of that terrible war, and turned their attention to the future. They could not have known that they had only cut down the tree and left the seed buried in the soil. Bane walked alone into the darkness that followed, and he understood something that most Sith had never truly grasped. Extinction can look like victory to the people you've defeated. He spent time on the ancient Sith homeworld called Korriban, a scorched red planet where the old Sith kings had once ruled, where dark side energy saturated the very stone and soil, where the Valley of the Dark Lords held tombs and temples, and the recorded knowledge of thousands of years of Sith philosophy preserved in holocrons, those crystalline devices that recorded the thoughts and teachings of the dead. He walked through those valleys, communed with the echoes of ancient masters like Darth Revan and Freedon Nad, absorbed their wisdom and their warnings and their accumulated knowledge of how power had been built and how it had been squandered. And slowly, in the quiet of those ruins, a new vision began to form in his mind. The Brotherhood of Darkness had failed because it was too many, too sprawling, too full of competing egos and ambitions, too easily torn apart from within. What if the Sith became two instead of an ocean? What if, instead of attempting to conquer the galaxy directly with a massive army, the Sith simply waited and grew stronger and worked in secret and spread roots so deep and so invisible that by the time anyone realized what had happened, resistance would be too late? What if the Sith became patient? He called it the Rule of Two. From this point forward, there would only ever be two Sith at any time, a master who embodied the absolute power of the dark side, and an apprentice who served, who learned, who burned with the hunger to one day surpass and supplant their teacher. This was not a compromise, and it was not weakness. It was the opposite. The master would choose the apprentice, train them, teach them everything they knew, every secret, every power, every technique drawn from centuries of accumulated dark side lore. And the apprentice would grow stronger, knowing that one day, perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not for decades, they would be strong enough to kill their teacher and become the master themselves. That hunger would shape them, refine them, forge them into something harder and more dangerous than they would ever have become in a stable hierarchy. Only the strongest would survive. The Sith would no longer destroy themselves. They would select, across generations, for absolute dominance. It was evil made surgical. It was darkness that understood itself. And so Bane moved into the shadows, and the 1,000-year darkness began. He found a child, a girl survivor of Ruusan, lost and grieving among the ruins of the battlefield, and he took her as his first apprentice, and he named her Zana, and he began to teach her the old ways. The Jedi Order went about their work, protecting their thousands of worlds, certain that the great enemy was gone. The Galactic Republic, battered and bleeding from centuries of war, began to rebuild itself, safe in the belief that the Sith were no more than a cautionary tale. Neither of them knew that, in the quiet places, in the forgotten temples, in the spaces between stars, a new Sith order was growing like a seed underground, invisible, patient, absolutely committed to the long game. It would take 1,000 years. It would take multiple generations of masters and apprentices, each one slightly stronger than the last, each one refining the philosophy, sharpening the tools. But when the Sith finally emerged again into the light, they would be nothing like what came before. They would be focused, strategic, disciplined, and unstoppable. And that story, that long, patient walk through darkness, the way one broken man's vision shaped the destinies of billions, is where we begin. Long before Darth Bane walked alone through the corridors of Korriban, before the Rule of Two was even a thought in anyone's mind, the wound that would define everything had already been opened. 25,000 years before the events we've just finished discussing, on a world called Tithon Deep in the galactic core, a group of Force sensitives gathered together for the first time with a shared understanding that the Force itself could be studied, learned, mastered. They were not the first to sense the Force. That gift was scattered across 1,000 worlds and 1,000 peoples. But they were perhaps the first to try to systematize it, to build something deliberate and lasting around it. The Jedi Order, as it came to be called, grew from this impulse. The belief that the Force could be understood, that its secrets could be preserved, that those who wielded it could be trained and guided toward wisdom. But on Tithon, something terrible happened that we need to understand, because it echoes down through every millennium that follows. When the early Jedi meditated deeply, when they opened themselves fully to the Force's flow, something unpredictable would occur. A violent storm would tear through the meditation chambers, born entirely from their own emotions, their own will. If a Jedi's connection to the light was too bright, too absolute, the Force itself seemed to reject it, and the reaction was catastrophic. The same thing happened on the other side. Surrender too completely to darkness, to anger and hunger and despair, and the storm would come again with even greater ferocity. This taught them something crucial, and I think you can hear the wisdom in it even now. Balance was not a suggestion, It was a physical law. You could not live in the Force without accepting both its light and its shadow. And yet, and this is where the wound truly begins, some of the early Jedi concluded that even understanding this balance meant understanding the dark side itself. If you had to study darkness to avoid being destroyed by it, didn't that mean you had to practice it, even a little? Didn't wisdom require knowing what you were refusing? The Order split over this question around 500 years after its founding, and the split was not clean. A Jedi named Zenda believed that the dark side was not something to be merely understood, but genuinely wielded, that true power came from embracing all aspects of the Force, including the ones the Order said were forbidden. He was not wrong about the power part, and that's the tragedy of it. Those who followed him, who came to be called the Legions of Leto, were formidable, and for a time they seemed to prove that Zenda's philosophy worked. But they were ultimately defeated, hunted down, driven out, and something hardened in the Jedi Order that day. The message became not, the dark side is dangerous, but the dark side is evil, and those who practice it are monsters who must be destroyed. That phrase, must be destroyed, is important because it is not the language of wisdom or caution. It is the language of vengeance. The Jedi won the conflict with Zenda, but they did not extinguish the belief he had planted. Across the next few thousand years, others would come to the same conclusions he had reached, through their own questioning and their own exploration of the Force's deeper mysteries. Each time the Jedi would confront them, fight them, drive them away. And each time the exiles would flee further, searching for worlds where they could practice in peace, where they wouldn't be hunted. Eventually, those exiles found themselves in a distant corner of space where a red-skinned species called the Sith had evolved naturally, Force-sensitive in their own right, ancient and proud and bitter about their place in the galaxy. The exiled Dark Jedi saw them not as equals, but as a people to be conquered, ruled over, made into an empire. They became God Kings to the Sith, and from that conquest, the Sith Empire was born. And now there were two orders, not one, and they would spend thousands upon thousands of years trying to destroy each other. What strikes me about this, when I think about it carefully, is how much of it came from a single refusal to coexist with complexity. The Jedi Order was founded on the principle that balance was necessary, that the Force contained light and dark, and that understanding both was crucial to survival. But when forced to face the reality of that complexity, they chose instead to draw a line and say, this side is good, and that side is evil, and evil must be destroyed. In doing so, they guaranteed the very thing they feared most. By making darkness into something that could only be eradicated, never negotiated with, never understood as part of a larger whole, they ensured that darkness would organize itself into something with the capacity to fight back. The exiles became the Sith not because they had always been fundamentally evil, but because the Jedi had given them no other choice, no path home, no space to exist. And the Sith, once they had tasted the kind of power that the Jedi Order had rejected, decided that the Jedi had been weak. They decided that the answer to the Jedi's refusal to fully embrace the dark side was to refuse to acknowledge the light at all. So if the Jedi were wrong about one thing, the Sith were equally wrong about their opposite number. And now you had a conflict that could never truly be resolved, because both sides had made a decision about what the other side was, and that decision precluded understanding. This is the ancient wound. It is not a conflict born of genuine cosmic evil or inevitable opposition. It is born of a choice, made by people who could have chosen differently, to see their enemies not as fellow seekers lost on a different path, but as monsters who had to be annihilated. And once that choice was made, once that story was told, it repeated across the millennia like a drumbeat you could not stop. Jedi and Sith would clash. The Sith would be defeated, scattered into the shadows, forbidden from the known galaxy. And in those shadows, across centuries and centuries, A new generation would grow up understanding only that they were hunted, that the Jedi had taken everything from them, that their people's only choice was to become strong enough to take it back. Which is precisely the thought Darth Bane would have, alone in the tombs of Korriban, reading the histories of his people's endless war. Which is why, when he emerged from the ruin of Ruusan with his rule of 2, he was not inventing something new. He was attempting to use patience and shadow to win the war that frontal assault had never won. The wound was already ancient by that point, thousands of years old, and it would not heal. It would only wait and scheme and prepare to open again. Long before the Jedi and Sith tore the galaxy in half, long before the Republic's bright idea of democracy spread across the stars, there was another empire, older, hungrier, and in its way far more absolute. It rose from a single world hidden so deep in the unknown regions that most of the galaxy would never know it existed, a planet called Lehon, though its masters preferred to call it Rakata Prime. The Rakata themselves were a tall species, reptilian in bearing, with elongated heads and eyes that seemed always to be calculating, always assessing what could be taken and how. There is a coldness in the records when people describe them, not moral judgment exactly, but something like the sense you get when you observe a predator moving through its territory with perfect confidence in its dominion. They were almost entirely force-sensitive, and this fact remade their entire civilization into something the galaxy had never quite seen before or would see again. Where most species might have developed industry and trade, the Rakata built their mastery on a simple truth. They could touch the Force, and they could weaponize it in ways others could not. Their ships did not navigate the stars as you and I might think of navigation, charting courses between beacons, measuring distance by the cold math of space. Instead, their vessels moved along lines of dark side energy that ran through the galaxy like veins, following concentrations of malevolence and corruption the way a ship might follow a current. To travel, you had to be able to feel the dark side, to sense its presence, to let it guide your movement through the void. This gave the Rakata something close to a monopoly on the stars themselves. Around 30,000 years before the time we are walking toward together, the Rakata spread outward from their hidden world and began to build what they called the Infinite Empire. It was a good name for it, not because it was truly limitless, but because it felt limitless to those caught beneath it. World after world fell under Rakatan rule. Kashyyyk, with its great forests and the towering Wookiees who lived there. Manaan, a water world whose inhabitants understood the secrets of Kolto, a substance that would matter to the galaxy for millennia to come. Tatooine, a desert world that would one day birth the Chosen One, though the Rakata could never have known that. Dantooine, with its rolling plains. And many others, each conquered, each enslaved, each added to an empire that seemed as inevitable as gravity. The Rakata did not conquer kindly. They took entire populations and bent them to building projects of staggering scale, monuments to Rakatan ambition and Rakatan power, structures that would endure for tens of thousands of years simply because they were built well enough to outlast empires. There is something almost incomprehensible about that, the casual confidence it required, the absolute certainty that their dominion was permanent and unquestionable. But at the heart of their empire, at the center of their reach, the Rakata created something that would echo through history, a place called the Star Forge. It orbited the star Lehon, a mechanical planet unto itself, a factory of almost unimaginable scale, powered not by fusion or conventional means, but by the dark side of the Force itself. The Star Forge did not merely manufacture weapons and ships. It did so endlessly, drawing energy and matter directly from the star it circled, converting raw stellar fire into an inexhaustible stream of war material. It was, in a very real sense, the engine of the Infinite Empire, the reason that conquest could continue forever, that resistance could be ground down through sheer attrition of firepower. The Star Forge fed on the dark side, and the dark side fed it in return, a cycle of mutual corruption that made the station stronger the more destruction it enabled. There is something almost alive about such a description, though I don't know if the Rakata would have recognized the distinction. For them, it was simply the perfect expression of power. They built star maps, navigational keys hidden across their empire on conquered worlds, so that if ever their central authority failed, their successors could find their way back to the Star Forge, to the heart of what they had built. They seemed confident enough in their dominion that even contingency planning felt like confidence. And for a very long time, that confidence was justified. The infinite empire endured, and the galaxy bowed, and the Rakata drew resources and labor and tribute from 1,000 worlds. And then, somewhere in the slow turning of ages, something broke. It began, as far as the records can tell us, with a plague. Not a plague of the body, though it killed nonetheless. At least, it killed everything the Rakata were. It was a plague of severance, a catastrophic severing of the connection that bound the Rakata to the Force itself. Imagine, for a moment, what that would mean. An entire civilization built on a foundation of Force sensitivity, every technology, every ship, every advantage dependent on that connection, and then suddenly, gone. The Force-sensitive minds that had navigated Rakatan ships through dark side pathways could no longer feel the dark side. The pilots lost their way between worlds. The priests and scientists who operated the Star Forge could no longer channel the power it required. The Forge fell silent, its endless production ending in an instant that must have felt like the closing of a fist. Everything the Rakata had built required hands that could touch the Force, and the hands suddenly, mysteriously, could not. I think about the meaning of that a great deal. The Rakata had built an empire on the assumption that the dark side was eternal, that their connection to it was unquestionable and unconditional, that their dominion was a law of nature rather than a gift that could be withdrawn. And then the gift was withdrawn. In the chaos of that moment, ships falling out of the sky, communication breaking down, the immense machineries of conquest grinding to a halt, the slave species began to understand something the Rakata had never truly grasped, that they were no longer helpless. Across 1,000 worlds, the oppressed rose up against their masters with an urgency born of centuries of servitude and years of watching the collapse unfold in real time. The Rakata, for the first time since they had spread across the stars, found themselves pushed back, divided, losing territory not to superior intellect or greater cunning, but to sheer momentum of rebellion. The empire tore itself apart from within as well, as factions of Rakata warred with one another, no longer unified by the certainty of infinite power. There were no more ships to send. There was no more reinforcement to call. There was only a slow retreat, a disintegration, a return to the homeworld by those who made it back alive. The infinite empire, which had seemed eternal, which had seemed like the very structure of the cosmos, collapsed in the space of what we might call a few generations, time enough to see dominion become poverty, immortal rule become tribal survival. The Rakata descended, over the long ages that followed, into a primitive existence on their home world, their advanced heritage becoming myth, their libraries becoming sealed temples, their great machines becoming mysteries, even to their own descendants. The Star Forge, that monument to endless production, was abandoned and fell dormant, waiting in the dark for hands that could touch the Force again. And the 1,000 worlds they had enslaved began, slowly and uncertainly, to build civilizations of their own. The collapse of the infinite empire left a power vacuum that would define the next 5,000 years of galactic history. Other species rose, other orders formed, and none of them, I think, ever quite understood how close they had come to a permanent state of servitude, how near the galaxy came to never knowing freedom at all. The Rakata's fall was not a heroic tale. There are no heroes in it that I can name. But it is a reminder, standing here looking back across 30,000 years, that even empires that seem absolute can fracture, that connection to power is more fragile than those who hold it dare to believe, and that the enslaved, given a moment of weakness in their master's grip, will reach for something better. In the aftermath of the Rakata's collapse, when their great machines fell silent and their conquered worlds rose in scattered rebellion, something quieter was happening in the deep core, something that would prove to matter far more than any of the empires that fell. On a planet called Tithon, isolated and deep in the galactic interior, Force sensitives from across the galaxy began to find their way, drawn by something they could not quite name. They came as wanderers at first, exiles and solitary seekers, some fleeing the chaos of the Rakata's dissolution, others following a pull they felt in the Force itself, a kind of homing instinct that told them others like them were gathering. There is something poignant in that image, I think. People who had lived their entire lives thinking they were alone, discovering that there were others. Others who felt the storms inside their own minds when emotion grew too wild, the way the Force itself would respond to their anger or their despair with violence. Others who had learned, in silence and in isolation, that the Force was not a thing you conquered, but a thing you had to learn to walk within. These early Force users on Tithon began, gradually, to do something that had not been done before on any large scale. They began to teach one another. They studied the nature of the Force itself, not as a weapon to be mastered, but as a phenomenon to be understood, the way a scientist might study a river, learning its patterns, its danger points, the way it moved. And they discovered something crucial. The Force on Tithon was not stable. When emotions ran too high, when the conflict between light and dark grew sharp enough, the planet itself would respond, violent storms of pure Force energy that could tear apart everything the early Seekers were building. It was, in a way, the planet teaching them what the Rakata's slaves had learned across 1,000 conquered worlds. That imbalance cannot be sustained. The difference was that these people had the luxury to think about it, to sit with it, to ask why the Force responded the way it did. Over generations, they began to articulate a philosophy, a way of being with the Force that emphasized harmony and understanding rather than domination. They spoke of peace, not as the absence of conflict, but as the state of acceptance that came when you stopped struggling against the current of the Force and learned instead to move with it. They spoke of knowledge, not knowledge for its own sake, but the deep comprehension that came from truly studying something rather than merely using it. And they spoke of serenity, a calm that came not from indifference, but from the understanding that fear and anger were not guides, but distortions. In the old legends, the storytellers spoke of these early seekers as the Jedi Order, a name that came from words meaning balance, from the Dai Bendu philosophy of walking a centered path. There is something in that name that captures what they were trying to do, not to erase one side of the Force and leave only the other, but to stand between them, to honor the danger and the peace equally, to understand that both existed. But I want to be careful with that word, balance, because it can sound peaceful in a way the reality was not. There were dark side predators in the galaxy, Force users who had no interest in harmony or understanding, who saw the Force as a tool for dominion, for fear, for the taking of what they wanted. And isolated Force sensitives, people living alone on frontier worlds or lost stations, had little defense against them. The gathering on Tithon was not only philosophical, then it was also practical, protective. When Force sensitives began to band together, to formalize their teaching and their philosophy, part of what they were doing was creating a structure that could defend against those who would prey on them. They developed weapons imbued with the Force itself, tools that amplified their will, and over a very long time, through generations and refinement, these weapons would become what we know as lightsabers. They created the first temples and schools where young Force sensitives could learn not only technique, but wisdom, places of sanctuary where a gift that had once been a lonely danger could become something shared. There is something almost tender in imagining that people who had felt broken or strange their whole lives, suddenly finding a community, a place where what they were was not feared, but studied and honored. But there is also something else worth sitting with, something difficult. Because as the Order on Tithon grew and refined its philosophy, it began to move away from balance and toward the light. The early emphasis on harmony, on walking between both sides of the Force, began to give way to a conviction that there was a correct way and an incorrect way, that serenity and peace and knowledge were the highest virtues, and that those who embraced fear, anger, and domination were in fundamental error. This was not wrong, precisely. The dark side is dangerous, and there was real wisdom in understanding its perils. But it was a choice, and it had consequences. There were Force sensitives who believed differently, who thought the balance philosophy was incomplete, who felt that certain kinds of strength required embracing what the growing Jedi Order called the dark side. And so the same pattern that had played out between the early dark Jedi and the light-focused Jedi millennia earlier, on some forgotten world in the Outer Rim, began to repeat itself here. Over time, those who disagreed with the Jedi Order's emphasis on light-side philosophy were exiled, were opposed, were driven away. And in being driven away, they became hardened. They began to gather in their own distant places, to embrace the very teachings the Jedi feared, to build their own order in the image of everything the Jedi had decided they stood against. The cycle was beginning again, and the very act of trying to erase the dark side, or to exclude it, or to declare that one way was true and all others false. This was the thing that ensured the dark side would return, harder and more vengeful, shaped by the rejection it had suffered. In this way, the founding of the Jedi Order was also, inevitably, the seeding of the Sith. It was not meant to be a tragedy, and in many ways, the Jedi on Tithon did create something real and beautiful, a sanctuary for Force sensitives, a place where the Force was studied with genuine reverence and care. But there was always going to be a cost to that clarity, to that choice to stand on one side and declare the other lesser. And that cost would be paid across thousands of years, in wars and in darkness, in the eventual rise of those who had been told they were wrong and who had decided to prove their power through conquest. I think of it sometimes on nights when I am thinking about how orders are formed, how philosophies are chosen, how one moment's reasonable judgment, this is the way, this is the truth, becomes the seed of future suffering. The Jedi on Tithon, in their wisdom, created the structure that would eventually save the galaxy from tyrants. But in their wisdom, they also sowed the seeds of the very darkness they were trying to keep at bay. That is the strange mathematics of these very old stories. It is a strange thing to think about a person who saved the galaxy and then became the reason the galaxy nearly fell, all within the course of a single lifetime, sometimes within the span of a few years. His name was Revan, and he was a Jedi general of extraordinary capacity, the kind of commander whose presence on a battlefield seemed to steady the Republic's forces the way a lodestone steadies a compass. But before we talk about how he fell, we need to understand why he rose at all, and what it was that made him willing to defy the very order that had trained him. Around the year 3976, before the events of A New Hope, the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders, warriors from the brutal outer reaches of known space, began a calculated invasion of Republic territory under their leader Mandalore, the Ultimate. These were not raiders or pirates. They were an organized military force, hardened by generations of conflict, and they came with fleets and discipline and a hunger for conquest that the Republic's standing military had grown soft enough to underestimate. The Jedi Council, in its wisdom and caution, chose not to commit the Order to the war. There were other threats to consider, other worlds to protect, and the Jedi had learned across millennia to be careful about where they lent their power. But Revan, watching Republic worlds fall and refugees pour into safe systems, felt something the Council could not quite justify turning away from, a moral urgency that seemed to demand action. He was not unique in feeling it. Many young Jedi sensed the same pull, the same conviction that the Order's neutrality was itself a kind of betrayal. And so Revan did something that would echo across the next 1,000 years of Jedi history. He defied the Council and marched to war anyway. Those Jedi who followed him became known as the Revanchists, and they were among the brightest and most idealistic the Order had produced. His second in command was a younger officer named Alec, a man of fierce loyalty and equally fierce ambition, who would later take the name Darth Malak. Together, as Supreme Commander of the Republic forces, Revan proved himself a general of almost supernatural strategic brilliance. The Mandalorian Wars raged across sectors and years, nearly 2 decades of grinding conflict, but slowly, methodically, Revan turned the tide against an enemy that had seemed unstoppable. And I think it's important to pause here and acknowledge something that the Jedi texts sometimes gloss over. He did this not through strength of character alone, but because something was changing in him as the war continued. The longer he fought, the longer he made the kinds of choices that a commander has to make, the more he began to understand the seductive logic of power, the way that survival and victory can justify increasingly dark decisions. There is something in that, the slow corruption that comes not from a single moment of temptation, but from 100 small compromises, each one reasonable in isolation, each one pushing you further into territory you never intended to enter. The war's climax came at the planet Malacha V, and here Revan made a choice that would define him. He activated an ancient superweapon known as the Mass Shadow Generator, a device that tore the very Earth apart and killed not only the remaining Mandalorian forces, but vast numbers of Republic soldiers as well. It was, in military terms, devastatingly effective. It was also the kind of choice that tells you something fundamental about a person. That survival, that victory, has begun to matter more than the cost of achieving it. When the dust settled, Revan himself met Mandalore the Ultimate in single combat and defeated him, taking the warrior's distinctive helmet as a trophy and effectively scattering the Mandalorian clans back into isolation. The war was over, and the Republic had won. But Revan was changed, and he was not content to simply return to peace. Instead, he took his fleet, ships crewed by soldiers who loved him, Jedi who had fought beside him, and he turned away from known space entirely, following traces of Mandalorian exploration into the unknown regions, the vast territories beyond the mapped galaxy where ships sometimes disappeared and maps grew uncertain. And there, in that darkness beyond the known worlds, something happened that would reshape everything. Revan and Malak, in pursuit of an ancient mystery, found the remains of a civilization so old that the galaxy had nearly forgotten it existed. The Rakata, the extinct empire we spoke of in earlier chapters, whose power had been shattered by plague thousands of years before. But more importantly, they found the Star Forge, an ancient space station of such technological sophistication and such abundance that it seemed almost alive, capable of producing ships and soldiers and weaponry in quantities that had no limit. And they found, waiting for them in the darkness, the remnants of the Sith, not the extinct order that the Jedi believed they had destroyed 1,000 years before, but something deeper, older, and vastly more patient. Bane's rule of 2 had worked exactly as intended, invisible to the Jedi, growing in strength through obscurity, waiting through the long centuries for the moment when it could move openly again. Whether Revan and Malak encountered a Sith master directly or found only teachings, only knowledge left in the tombs of dead Dark Lords on worlds like Korriban, the result was the same. They fell to the dark side. I say fell, but that is perhaps not quite accurate. It implies a sudden loss of footing, a stumble. What happened was more like a door opening, slowly, to a room they had already been walking toward without quite admitting it to themselves. Revan, now calling himself Darth Revan, and Malak, now Darth Malak, returned to the galaxy as Dark Lords, and with the power of the Star Forge behind them, They began a new war that the Republic had no defenses against. The Jedi Civil War, as history would call it, lasted from approximately 3959 to 3956 before the Clone Wars, and it brought the Republic to the edge of extinction. Fleets emerged from nowhere in impossible numbers. Soldiers poured from the Star Forge faster than the Republic could destroy them, and worlds fell like dominoes. For a brief, terrible span of time, it seemed not just possible but probable that the Sith would succeed where they had always failed, that they would remake the galaxy in the image of the dark side, and the age of the Jedi would end not with a bang, but with the slow extinguishing of hope. But even in triumph, something fractured between Revan and Malak, the very thing that Darth Bane had built the rule of two to prevent and also to ensure: the hunger of the apprentice for the master's power. During a crucial engagement, Malak betrayed Revan, firing on his own Dark Lord's ship, using the moment of vulnerability to strike a killing blow and seize the title of Dark Lord for himself. Revan survived barely, but the survival came at a cost: catastrophic memory loss, a mind erased and remade by the Jedi Council, a man who had been the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known rendered into someone who did not remember his own name. There is something almost cruel in that mercy, though I understand the necessity of it. The woman who saved his life, a Jedi named Bastila Shan, who possessed the rare ability to influence entire battles through the Force, bound herself to him through a Force bond, a connection deeper than friendship, almost like a rope thrown to someone drowning. And so Revan, the man who had nearly conquered the galaxy, woke in a new identity, a new skin, a new story, with no memory of the old one, except in the moments when the past would rise up and haunt him like a ghost he couldn't quite see. The war itself would not be over. Malak would continue it, and others would rise to challenge him. But already the shape of the next chapter was becoming clear. Something in Revan, even stripped of memory, even rebuilt from the ground up, was still the same fundamental thing: capable of change, capable of redemption, capable of becoming something other than what the darkness had made him. That is not the story the Sith usually tell about themselves, and perhaps that is why it mattered. Let that thought settle a moment before we move forward. There is something in the idea of a person who falls and then rises again, who is given not justice but a second chance, a second name, a second life. She was only 23 years old, and she carried in her mind the weight of fleets. Bastila Shan had come to the Jedi Order young, a girl of considerable gift, and if you let her speak honestly, considerable pride. The kind of young person who sensed her own talent the way others sensed temperature, and felt it acutely. Her father had been a treasure hunter, a man who measured his worth in credits and artifacts, and that hunger for proof, for validation, lived in her bones even after she'd sworn to let it go. The Jedi taught her to meditate on stillness, but her mind was never still. It moved like a thing alive, calculating, reaching, always reaching for what came next. And then they discovered what she could do with the Force, something they called battle meditation, the ability to touch the consciousness of an entire fleet, to steady minds that were wavering, to turn soldiers who were breaking toward something like courage. They put her on ships. They sent her toward the sound of firing. And by the time the Mandalorian Wars ended, Bastila had learned that her gift was real, that it mattered, that armies lived or died by the quality of her focus. That's a dangerous thing to learn when you are young and already half in love with the idea of being necessary. When Revan and Malak left the Order to fight those wars, when they took command and led the Republic to victory, something in Bastila had followed them in spirit, even as her body stayed behind on the peaceful worlds the Jedi guarded. She was good at what she did, at the meditation, at the control, but there was a small voice in her that wondered if Revan was better, if Revan had understood something about power and purpose that the Council had kept from her. And then came the news. The man she had almost worshipped had fallen to the dark side. He had become a Sith Lord named Darth Revan, and he was coming to destroy everything she had sworn to protect. The Jedi Council gave her a new assignment: lead the strike team that would capture him. Bastila, still young, still hungry to prove herself in ways she had not fully admitted, agreed without hesitation. The assault on Revan's flagship was brutal and fractured, like most things that happen in the moment when someone is truly trying to kill you. She remembers the fires, the smell of scorched metal, the screaming. She remembers reaching Revan, this man she had once admired, now twisted into something cold and sharp, and feeling something crack open in her chest that she had carefully sealed. And then Malak, his own apprentice, betrayed him, fired on his own master's ship from orbit, a bolt of destruction meant to wipe Revan away completely. Bastila felt it coming through the Force like a wave, felt Revan dying, felt the moment when she was supposed to let him fall. But she didn't. She threw everything she had into the Force, everything she was, and she caught him, not with her hands but with the full weight of her gift, holding him to life the way a hand holds water. In that moment, something between them fused, a bond that was not just connection but entanglement, two consciousnesses pressing against one another with nowhere to hide. She had never felt anything like it before. The Jedi Council, when they recovered Revan's broken body, made their calculation. Erase his memory, implant a new identity, use the bond between him and Bastila to find the hidden Sith Empire and the Star Forge that kept it fed. Bastila agreed to this too, because what else was she supposed to do? But the bond remained, and it changed something in her that she could not yet name. They sent the amnesiac man into the galaxy with orders and a false life, and Bastila watched him go, felt him go through the Force, carried him in her mind like a secret. For months, he moved through the darkness they had set him to search, recovering fragments of memory, learning of the star maps, gathering companions on a dozen worlds. And Bastila tracked him through that journey without meaning to, the bond pulling at her constantly, like a line tied around her heart. And then came the day when Malak found them aboard his flagship, the Leviathan, in the black cold of space. The new Dark Lord had learned patience from Revan's fall. He did not kill the amnesiac immediately, but instead revealed what he had done, showed him the truth of who he was, the memories of being Darth Revan, of commanding armies of the dark side, of choosing cruelty and power. Bastila felt it all through the bond, the shock of it, the agony of the man she had saved, remembering that he was the man she had sworn to destroy. And then Malak took her. What they did to her aboard that ship is not something it is kind to dwell on. The torture, yes, but more than that. The patient, calculated work of showing her that everything she believed about herself was shallow, that her pride was really cowardice wearing another name, that her gift for battle meditation was just vanity dressed up as service. Malak was very good at finding the cracks that were already there. He twisted her slowly, the way you might twist a rope, and by the end, she was not the young Jedi girl anymore, but something she could barely recognize, something that answered to him, something dark. She became his Sith, and she felt herself becoming it, felt the relief of it almost, the way it was easier to believe in power and darkness than to keep reaching for light that kept slipping through her fingers. There's something I think about a lot in what happened next. The bond between them, the thing that was supposed to give the Jedi an advantage, became the only thing that could break through what Malak had done to her. When the redeemed Revan, the man choosing the light despite everything he had been, confronted her aboard the Star Forge, he did not defeat her through strength or through the raw power of the Force. He reached for her through that bond, and he offered her a choice that Malak had never given her. The choice to believe that she was more than her worst moments, that pride and weakness could be forgiven, that coming back to the light was not defeat, but a kind of courage that darkness could not comprehend. I think about how young they both were, really. Both of them carrying enormous power and burden, both of them bruised in ways the Force could sense but not heal alone. And I think about the strange grace embedded in the Force bond itself, that what was meant to be a tool of manipulation became instead a channel for genuine redemption, for for two people seeing each other fully and choosing each other anyway. Bastila came back to the light, not because she was forced, but because someone she had saved was willing to save her in turn. And in doing so, they set a precedent that would echo through the Shan family line for millennia to come. The idea that love and strength were not opposites, that redemption was possible even when the darkness had gone very deep. When it was finished, when Malak was dead and the Star Forge was falling into ruin, something had shifted in the galaxy, not visible on any chart, not recorded in any official history, but real nonetheless. The dark side had been turned back, but not through annihilation, through the strange, patient work of choosing love when power was available, choosing connection when isolation was easier. There is something in that choice that feels important to hold onto. It suggests that the darkness that would rise again in the coming centuries, the shadows that would gather in hidden spaces, might be met not just with force, but with the possibility of redemption. Though whether the galaxy would remember that lesson, or whether it would be forced to learn it again and again, remained to be seen. And for a moment, before the weight of the next century descended, there was simply this: peace, and two people who had seen the worst of each other and survived it together. So we arrive at the Star Forge, this ancient monument to a power that had already forgotten itself, built by the Rakata when they ruled everything, and now waiting in the darkness for a Dark Lord to find it and learn what it could teach. Revan had discovered it through the star maps, those scattered Rakatan navigational keys left behind on Dantooine, Tatooine, Kashyyyk, Manaan, and Korriban. Breadcrumbs laid down 30,000 years ago by a civilization that had long since crumbled into tribal memory. The station hung in orbit above Lehon, the unknown world, drawing power directly from the blue star beside it, a factory of war that could produce fleets without ceasing, feeding on the dark side itself to fuel its endless machinery. What Revan and Malak had found in that place was not just a weapon. It was the realization of Sith ambition made manifest: unlimited resources, unlimited production, the means to wage total war against the Republic and the Jedi without constraint. For 3 years, the Sith Civil War had burned across the galaxy because of what the Star Forge could make: warships and fighters that poured from its construction bays in waves, an endless tide of metal and fire that the Republic fleet could not match. I think about what that must have felt like for the Jedi Council, watching their order diminish, world after world falling to an enemy they could not outproduce, could not outlast, an enemy that seemed to have infinite reach and infinite arms. But there was a crack in that edifice, and its name was Bastila Shan. The young Jedi's battle meditation had been twisted by Malak, her gift perverted into a weapon that synchronized and empowered the Sith fleet, a single woman's will stretching across the void to make an army move with one mind. And when Revan reached her, not through violence or domination, but through the bond between them, through the offer of redemption, something broke in the machinery of the Sith war effort. She came back to the light not because she was forced to, but because someone chose to believe she could be redeemed, that the darkness she had been shaped into was not her truest self. That choice matters more than any strategic consideration, though of course it had devastating strategic consequences. With Bastila's battle meditation turned to the defense of the Republic fleet, the balance shifted. The Sith could no longer coordinate their response with perfect synchronicity, and what Malak had built began to show its first real weakness. Revan, meanwhile, made his way deeper into the Star Forge itself, through corridors that thrummed with dark side power, through chambers where the Rakata had once stood as gods, and now only echoes remained. Malak waited at the heart of the station, clinging to life through sheer dark side will, draining the force from Jedi prisoners held in stasis, feeding on their suffering to sustain himself, a lord who had become less a man than a conduit for the Star Forge's hunger. And when Revan struck him down, when the Dark Lord who had betrayed his master, who had pursued conquest across 1,000 worlds, finally fell, something crucial shifted in the architecture of the Sith themselves. The Republic fleet, coordinated now by Bastilla's restored gift, assaulted the Star Forge with everything they had. Karth Onasi flying with the precision of a man who had learned to trust his commander again, the droid HK-47 and the astromech T-3M4 pushing deep into systems that had been built before human civilization began. And in the end, they burned it. Not through some great act of sabotage or a perfectly placed charge, but through sustained assault, through will and coordination, and the decision to pay any price to ensure that this engine of unlimited darkness could not continue. The Star Forge fell silent, its infinite production halted, its dark side hunger left with nothing left to feed on. What I want to linger on here is what this moment meant, not just what it was. The Sith had possessed a superweapon older than recorded history, powered by a technology that had enslaved the galaxy in ages past, and they had used it to build an empire that nearly consumed everything. And they lost it not to a superior technology or a larger army, but to choice. Bastilla choosing redemption, Revan choosing to reach for the light, a Republic fleet choosing to press forward even when everything seemed hopeless. The Star Forge represented a kind of certainty. That power was infinite, that production was unstoppable, that the darkness had already won, and only the mechanics of conquest remained. But the weapon that defeated it was fragility, a young woman's gift, carefully tended and then redeemed, a man who had been darkness himself and chose to remember what light felt like, an alliance bound by trust rather than fear. I find myself thinking about this a lot, actually. The Sith would rebuild, of course. We will come to that, and to what that meant for the galaxy. But they would never again have the Star Forge, never again possess an engine of unlimited resource and unlimited reach. What Malak had seized from Revan, thinking conquest was all that mattered, he had lost because he could not imagine that a person could choose to return from darkness, that an army could be bound by something other than command, that redemption was possible. The station burned against the Lehon star, Rakata technology finally exhausted, finally consumed, falling back into whatever force had animated it across 30,000 years of history. And on the other side of that burning, a galaxy that still had a chance, still had hope, because a handful of people chose to believe in it. With the Star Forge gone, the Sith fleet could not be sustained, could not be replenished, could not continue the war indefinitely as they had planned. The Jedi Civil War had broken the machine that Malak had built, and in breaking it, they had given the Republic something it had begun to lose, a future that was not yet written. In the quiet years that followed Malak's fall and the destruction of the Star Forge, something remarkable happened. The galaxy began, for the first time in living memory, to heal. The Jedi had fought so long in the shadows of greater wars. The Mandalorian threat, the Sith's return, the endless cycle of Dark Lords rising and being struck down, that many in the Order had nearly forgotten what peace looked like. But peace, when it finally came, did not arrive suddenly or as some miraculous gift. It came as a slow settling, like dust finally coming to rest after a great storm. The High Council on Coruscant, the gleaming heart of the Galactic Republic, began to breathe easier, and in that breathing, the Jedi Order began to change. For centuries after the destruction of the Star Forge, the Jedi saw no new Sith threat, no whisper of dark side activity that would demand their immediate, total focus. Some believed the darkness had truly been extinguished, that the final blow Revan had struck against Malak had somehow severed the Sith from the Force itself, the way the ancient Rakata had been severed millennia before. Others, quieter voices on the council, wondered if the darkness had not been destroyed so much, as it had simply learned to hide better than it ever had before. But those cautious voices were often gentle, sometimes even apologetic, as if speaking such doubts aloud in those bright decades felt almost ungracious. The Republic needed to believe the war was over. The Jedi, exhausted from generations of conflict, needed to believe it too. So the Order chose to believe, and in choosing, it transformed. Where once the Jedi had been, first and foremost, warriors, keepers of the light locked in perpetual struggle against the dark, they became something broader, something gentler, something almost hopeful about what the galaxy could be if darkness no longer threatened it. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant, already vast, began to expand. New wings were added, new chambers for meditation, new libraries to hold the ever-growing archive of light-side knowledge. Outward from Coruscant, the Jedi spread across thousands of worlds in the Galactic Republic. Temples and enclaves rose on peaceful worlds. On Dantooine, where training had long taken place, more permanent structures were built. On other settled worlds, smaller sanctuaries and gathering places took root. Young Force sensitives no longer had to travel to the capital to find instruction. The Jedi came to them, or they came to local enclaves, learning from masters who had spent years perfecting not combat, but harmony, not the art of war, but the principles of wisdom and compassion. The nature of the Order's mission subtly shifted, or perhaps more accurately, it broadened. The Jedi did not stop being protectors. That remained at the heart of their purpose, and their readiness never fully relaxed. But they became something more. Scholars, philosophers, counselors to the Republic's government, keepers of peace not just through force but through understanding. They meditated on the nature of the Force itself, deepening knowledge that had been built over millennia. They trained their minds and spirits to perceive the subtle currents of the living Force, the way it moved through all things, binding the galaxy together. There was a beauty in that work, I think, a kind of tenderness toward the Force that the wartime Jedi had not had the luxury to cultivate. At the same time, something else was happening, something the bright years obscured. The Jedi were becoming, in a real sense, dependent on the Republic in a way they had not been before. The Ruusan Reformation, which consolidated this new era, formally restructured the relationship between the Jedi and the Republic's government. The Order placed themselves in service to the Senate, to the Supreme Chancellor, their role now defined not as independent guardians of the Force, but as instruments of Republic policy. This was not presented as a loss. It was framed as necessary, as part of the galaxy's move toward a more stable, more civilized order. And in the broad strokes, it was true. The Jedi's wisdom and power, now directed toward peace rather than war, did make the Republic more secure, did help it expand and prosper. But there was something else underneath it, something that only becomes visible when you look back from a great distance. The Jedi had, without quite realizing it, made themselves servants of a political structure. The Council remained, making decisions about doctrine and the training of young Jedi. But those decisions existed now within the framework of what the Republic wanted, what the Senate expected, what the Supreme Chancellor believed was necessary for stability. I don't say this as a condemnation. The Jedi believed genuinely in the Republic, in its principles, in the possibility that a government could be just, and that they could help shape it toward justice. But there is something in that entanglement, in the way service to a political body gradually becomes indistinguishable from compliance, that troubles me when I think about it for too long. The centuries that followed were, by any measure, golden ones. Crime on the worlds under Jedi protection diminished. The Republic expanded without major military conflict. The infrastructure of civilization deepened and strengthened. Young Jedi learned in temples surrounded by beauty and peace, taught by masters who had never known anything but the quiet work of spiritual development. The archives on Coruscant grew so vast that it took a Jedi a lifetime of study to even begin to comprehend what they contained. Records of every Force tradition, every school of thought, every attempt by scholars across millennia to understand the deepest nature of the Force itself. The peace was sustained, and it was real. The suffering was reduced, and for many, meaningfully so. But it is a difficult thing to say, and yet I find I must. The very brilliance of those centuries, the sense that at last the Jedi had found their right place in the galaxy, may have made them blind to what was happening in the shadows. While the Jedi expanded outward, tending to thousands of worlds, training new generations in peace, building temples and libraries and centers of learning somewhere in the darkness. In a hidden temple on an ancient red world that no one remembered, in the minds of apprentices sworn to masters in the strictest secrecy, the Sith were still there. They had not been destroyed. They had only learned to vanish so completely that even the Jedi, for all their sensitivity to the Force, could not sense them. The rule of two, that elegant, patient mechanism, was working exactly as intended. Two where there had been hundreds, invisible where there had been seen, waiting where others sought to act. Darth Bane had achieved what the Sith had never quite managed before. He had made them capable of patience, and patience, it turns out, is the most dangerous weapon of all. And the 1,000 years of peace that followed, the golden age of the Jedi, was in a very real sense being built on a foundation that was already, quietly, being undermined. The Jedi did not know this. They could not know it, and in a way that is its own tragedy, that they were tending gardens while, beneath the soil, something was growing in the dark. But that is the nature of the story we are telling here. The peace was real, and the threat was real, and the Jedi did not know that they were living on borrowed time. The light that illuminated thousands of worlds was genuine. It was also, unknown to everyone, temporary. And in those quiet, glittering centuries, while the Order reached its fullest flowering, the seeds of its destruction were being patiently, methodically sown. There is a question I find myself coming back to, often late in the night when the story has been turning in my mind for hours. What is the difference between ambition and hunger? Alec, who would become Darth Malak, began his life as a Jedi, inseparable from a brilliant general named Revan, the two of them bound by the kind of friendship that makes young men feel invincible. When Revan decided to defy the Council and march into the Mandalorian Wars, Alec followed without hesitation, convinced that his companion was right and the Council was merely afraid. The wars came on, brutal and grinding, stretching across planets and years, and Revan's strategies grew darker as the necessity for victory grew sharper. At Malacha V, where the Mandalorian threat finally broke, Revan activated a superweapon called the Mass Shadow Generator, a device that did not distinguish between enemy and ally, that simply erased, and Alec watched the planet come apart. In the aftermath, when the Council's judgment arrived by distant transmission, cold and final, neither the victory nor the friendship felt clean anymore. Revan, undeterred, disappeared into the unknown regions with Alec in tow, and they found something there that the Jedi had forgotten. The Sith were not gone, and neither was the power they promised. When Revan returned as Darth Revan, the Dark Lord of a reborn Sith Order, Alec returned as his second, as Darth Malak, and for a time the apprenticeship felt like partnership, like they were still walking the same path together. But there is a particular kind of hunger that comes to those who have already tasted power, who have already bent worlds to their will, who have already worn the title of Dark Lord in their mind before it ever rested on their shoulders. Malak possessed that hunger in abundance. During a confrontation with the Jedi, when Revan was already gravely wounded and undefended, Malak gave the order: fire on his own master's vessel. The betrayal was surgical, calculated, the action of someone who had spent years watching and waiting for the moment when ambition could finally consume friendship. Revan survived the attack barely, and the Jedi captured him. And here the story turns, as it often does in the deep places of the galaxy, on a single choice that no one saw coming. Rather than execute him, the Council did something stranger. They erased him, wiped away his identity like scratching a name from a record, and sent him back into the galaxy as someone else entirely. Malak, now the Dark Lord in fact as well as ambition, did not spend much time wondering what had become of his former master. He had the Star Forge now, that ancient infinite factory built by the Rakata, a machine that could produce warships and droids without end, and he turned that production toward the Republic with the single-minded focus of someone who has already decided how the story will end. The Jedi Civil War, as it came to be called, was not subtle. Malak did not sneak or scheme in the manner that Bane had prescribed from the shadows. He struck openly, decisively, flooding the galaxy with Sith forces until the Republic staggered. And for a moment, it seemed that the darkness had simply swept away all the light that had gathered in the centuries since Bane's first rule of 2. But something interrupted his certainty. The man the Jedi had erased, the one they had given a new name and a new purpose, began to remember, piece by piece, who he actually was. And when he remembered, when Revan stood once again in full knowledge of his own nature, something in him had changed. The capacity for choice, for turning away, for redemption, had not been erased at all, but rather, impossibly, deepened. There was a woman named Bastila Shan, a young Jedi whose gift was something called battle meditation, the ability to touch entire fleets with her will and reshape their courage and certainty. Malak had captured her and turned her to the dark side, certain that her power would make his victory inevitable. But Revan reached through the bond that had formed between them and offered her something Malak could never have offered. The genuine possibility that she was not what she had become, that she could step back from darkness and not be consumed by it. It is a quiet miracle when you think about it, not the power to destroy, which is common enough in this story, but the power to redeem, to stand before someone in their darkness and say, "You are more than this." Revan walked the Star Forge, this factory of death and endless production, and faced Malak in the wreckage of their shared history. The duel between them was the final punctuation on an arc that had begun years earlier on dusty worlds during the Mandalorian Wars, and it ended not because Malak lacked power. He had grown vast and terrible, fed by the screaming of imprisoned Jedi he had drained to fuel his own dark strength. But because Revan had chosen something that Malak, in all his hunger, had never been able to choose. He had chosen not to be consumed by what he was. When Malak fell, defeated, Revan could have left him there in the dark. Instead, in the moment of victory, Revan offered his former friend a final mercy, the possibility, even then, of stepping back from the abyss. The offer was refused, but it was made, and that matters, I think, more than we often acknowledge. The Jedi fleet, with Bastila's meditation guiding their courage and resolve, brought the Star Forge down in sustained assault, and the infinite factory, that monument to the Rakata's ambition and the Sith's hunger for power without end, burned itself into ash and memory. With it fell the immediate threat of the darkness. The Sith were scattered, their superweapon destroyed, their brief moment of open conquest ended. The Republic, battered but unbroken, gathered itself and remembered that it was meant to endure. But underneath, patient and invisible, the true Sith Order continued in the shadows, watching, waiting, remembering that two people could conquer a galaxy slowly if they were willing to think in centuries rather than years. Malak's hunger had been a fire that burned too bright and too fast, and in burning, it had revealed a different kind of weakness in the darkness itself. The weakness of impatience, of wanting everything at once. The Sith who watched from the shadows learned this lesson carefully, and they would not repeat it. There is something almost tender in that, I find. The way even evil educates itself, refines itself, learns from its mistakes across the long, patient centuries. It is not comforting, but it is worth understanding. The galaxy had been given a reprieve, another chance to grow and heal and believe in the possibility of peace, and that too is part of this story, the part we should not hurry past. There is a moment, I think, in every great story when the world seems to tilt slightly, when a force that was distant and almost abstract suddenly becomes a presence you can no longer ignore. For the Galactic Republic and the Jedi Order in the years around 3963 before the Clone Wars, that moment arrived on the borders of the Outer Rim, carried on the drums of war and the unified voice of a people who had decided at last that they were ready to be reckoned with. The Mandalorians had always existed on the edge of Republic space, a warrior culture, fierce and insular, bound together by codes of honor and battle that outsiders found difficult to fully comprehend. But something had shifted among them. A leader had arisen named Mandalore the Ultimate, a figure of extraordinary charisma and tactical brilliance, who saw in the fractured clans of his people an opportunity for something greater than raids and regional skirmishes. He gathered them, unified them, gave them not just a shared purpose, but a shared aesthetic. Standardized armor in colors that declared faction and rank, the Neo-Crusaders, he called them, a new Mandalorian philosophy that married ancient warrior tradition with systematic, industrial conquest. There is something worth noting here about how order, even militaristic order, can feel like liberation to people who have lived without it. The Neo-Crusaders represented structure, identity, a clear hierarchy, and a clear purpose. For the younger warriors especially, it offered something the scattered clans never had, the promise that their strength might mean something beyond personal glory. By 3976, the Mandalorians began to move outward. First came the raids on Outer Rim settlements, worlds that the Republic barely remembered, places without significant defenses or galactic attention. Then came something larger, coordinated conquests, the systematic annexation of entire sectors under the brilliant field tactics of Kashyyy's Fett, Mandalore the Ultimate's chief marshal, a commander whose strategic mind seemed to anticipate every Republic response before it was even formulated. What happened next is one of those moments that reveals something about institutions and the people within them. The Jedi High Council, cautious as they always were, urged patience. Wait, they counseled the Senate, gather intelligence, do not rush into conflict without full understanding. There was wisdom in this, or so it seemed to the elder Jedi who had counseled restraint through centuries of relative peace. But there was also something else beneath the surface of their reluctance. A weariness, perhaps, a belief that the Republic's military could handle this threat, that the Jedi need not be the galaxy's first response to every danger. They had grown comfortable in their role as guardians and scholars. They had almost forgotten what it was to be soldiers. And then there was Revan. He was young, a Jedi still in his studies, but he had studied the Mandalorian threat with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He had read the reports from the frontier, watched the pattern of Mandalorian expansion with the same careful attention you might give to a predator's approach, and he had come to a conclusion that terrified him. The Jedi Council was wrong. The Mandalorians would not be stopped by patience or by limited Republic responses. They would not negotiate or back away. They were warriors who understood only strength, and if the Republic did not meet them with overwhelming force and Jedi power, the galaxy would burn. His closest companion was another young Jedi named Malak, Alec, as he was still called then, before he took on the name that would later echo through dark history. Together, they began to speak, to question, to draw other young Jedi into their circle of concern. It was not quite rebellion, not yet, but it was the beginning of a fracture. A schism opened in the Jedi Order itself, quiet but deepening. On one side were the young idealists like Revan and Malak, who believed the Jedi had to act, who could not bear to watch worlds fall to darkness while the Council debated and deliberated. On the other side were the elders who had maintained the order through centuries of peace and believed that rushing to war was precisely how the Jedi had fallen before, in eras history had taught them to fear. The conflict between these two visions of what the Jedi should be was, in many ways, more important than the war itself. Because what it meant was this: a young, brilliant Jedi general named Revan, overflowing with conviction and compassion for the suffering, made the choice to defy the Council and march to war. And when he did, others followed. The Jedi Exel, a figure whose name was Mitra Surik, though she would earn many other titles across her life, joined him, as did countless others who believed that the Jedi's duty was not abstract meditation, but direct action against the darkness, wherever it arose. Around 3963 BBY, the nature of the conflict shifted. It was no longer a Mandalorian expansion into the margins of Republic space. It became total war, galactic in scope, demanding conscription and fleet mobilization on a scale the peaceful Republic had not attempted in centuries. The Mandalorians pressed inward, world after world falling before their disciplined assault. And then came Cathar, one of those moments that clarifies everything that comes after it. The Cathar were a gentle people, more interested in philosophy and art than warfare, and they had chosen, as was their way, not to resist when Kashyyy's Fet and the Neo-Crusaders arrived at their world. The Mandalorians annihilated them anyway, a slaughter, a genocide, the destruction of an entire civilization simply because they could, because Kashyyy's Fet understood that terror was as much a weapon as a blaster. The massacre of Cathar galvanized the Republic in a way that abstract strategy could not. This was not a border dispute or a clash of regional powers. This was darkness moving across the face of the galaxy, and it had to be stopped. Revan became, in that moment, the embodiment of the Republic's will to survive. His charisma, his conviction, his refusal to believe that the Jedi could remain aloof from suffering, it caught fire across the military, and even across much of the Jedi Order itself. The Council's reluctance began to crumble, not because they had changed their minds, but because the alternative, to watch worlds burn while they maintained their meditation, had become unbearable. And so the Mandalorian Wars proper began. Young Jedi generals leading Republic forces against the Unified Might of Mandalore, the Ultimate, and Kashyyy's Fet. Battle after battle, world after world, the two sides collided in a grinding, exhausting conflict that would reshape the galaxy, and more importantly, reshape Revan himself. Because there is something about war, especially the kind of war that demands victory at any cost, that can change a person down to the core of who they are. For Revan, that change was only beginning. Yet what is most remarkable, looking back across the centuries, is that none of the key players, not Mandalore the Ultimate, not even Revan himself, fully understood the true nature of what was happening. There were invisible hands guiding the Mandalorians toward war, hidden Sith manipulating events from the shadows, turning a conflict of ideology and survival into a crucible that would eventually birth the greatest darkness the galaxy had yet seen. But in this moment, in the beginning, all anyone could see was the need to fight, to survive, to believe that their cause was just and their victory assured. That is how war begins, I think, not with understanding, but with conviction, and the two are so often mistaken for one another. The Mandalorian Wars had ignited, and the galaxy would never be quite the same. Revan woke, after more time than a human mind was meant to contain, in a cell that was less a room than a statement. You are not free, and you have never been free, and the concept of freedom is something that happens to other people. The Sith Emperor had kept him alive for reasons that had, over the centuries, become harder to distinguish from mercy. There was no torture, not in the way most beings understand it, no instruments, no casual cruelty for its own sake. Instead, there was the steady, patient work of consuming everything Revan was, and adding it to something so vast and hungry that it barely registered the addition. In the end, captivity that lasted long enough stopped being punishment and became simply the shape of your existence. Revan had spent so long in that cell that he had almost forgotten what his own voice sounded like. Almost, but not quite. The Jedi Council had taken his memories once before, remaking him into someone new, and Revan had carried a kind of gratitude for that erasure, because it let him become someone better. But what the Emperor had done was worse, because it was slower, and because it took place not in a single surgical moment, but across centuries. Bit by bit, the Emperor's presence had worn into him like water into stone, spreading through his consciousness, learning the shape of him, preparing to wear him away entirely. And Revan would never fully understand why something had shifted. It began with a memory that did not quite belong to him, or belonged to him from a life so distant it might as well have been someone else's. Mitra Surik, the Jedi who had followed him into darkness, who had walked with him into the unknown regions, was close. She was on Dromund Kars, the capital world of the hidden Sith Empire, the red dark place where the Emperor had built something like a reflection of himself across the entire planet. Revan did not know how he knew this, only that the knowing was suddenly, fiercely, undeniably real. There was a Mandalorian with her, Canderous Ordo, who had walked alongside both of them, who Revan had once named Mandalore, giving him a purpose beyond mercenary wages. Revan felt something crack inside himself, some wall the Emperor had built with patient centuries of pressure, and for the first time in longer than he could measure, he wanted something other than peace. He wanted to get out. It was a dangerous want, the kind that could destroy you if you were not careful, but it was his own, and in the Emperor's house, your own thoughts were the only real thing you had left. Mitra came. I want to linger on this moment, because there is a particular kind of grace in it. She came not as a soldier, not as a Jedi on an ideological mission, but as someone who had chosen, across the years and the distance, to keep faith with another person, even when that person had fallen into darkness, even when everyone else had written that person off as lost. That was the thing about Mitra Surik that the records often missed. She was not the Excel because she was exceptional or blessed, but because she had survived something that should have killed her, and rather than run from it or hide from it or try to make it mean something redemptive, she had simply carried it, and the carrying of it had made her unbreakable in a different way than power did. The plan was to infiltrate the Emperor's inner chambers and cut him down before he could react, a kind of surgical strike at the very heart of the Sith. It was, Revan understood even as it formed in his mind, the plan of people who still believed that the problem could be solved, that you could cut out the darkness and the rest would heal. He had believed that once too. The Emperor was expecting them, not consciously perhaps, but in the way a god does not consciously expect the insect on its skin. The Emperor had worn Revan like a glove for centuries. He knew the shape of this moment before they did. On Dromund Kars, in chambers shrouded in the pressure of the dark side itself, Mitra and Canderous fought the Emperor's servants, fought for ground that was more shadow than substance, fought toward Revan's cell with the kind of desperation that comes when you have nothing left to lose. And Scourge, a Sith Lord who had watched them come, who had been there to greet them, made a choice in that moment that would ripple across centuries. He had looked into the future, using the gift that all Sith Lords who walked in the Emperor's house eventually developed, the ability to sense the darkness that was coming, the shadows of what would be, and he had seen them fail. He had seen Revan break, broken already, beyond any possibility of redemption. He had seen the Emperor consume them all, and he had seen himself standing in the ashes of a galaxy that would fall to the void. And so he had made the only choice that, from that perspective, made any sense. He had struck down Mitra himself, severing her connection to the Force in the moment before she could reach him, and he had done it because he had glimpsed a future where that was the only way to survive. Revan understood, in the moment that he felt Mitra die, felt her presence in the Force simply cease, as if she had been a light someone had switched off, that the Emperor had won, and had won so thoroughly that the Emperor did not even need to be present for the victory to be complete. The Emperor had taught his servants to betray even hope itself. They brought Revan deeper still after that, into chambers far beneath the red surface of Dromund Kars, into a place called the Foundry, where the Emperor kept his oldest prisoners and his most elaborate schemes. In that place, Revan's mind began to fracture under a pressure that had never been designed to be survivable. He did not break into pieces. It was more subtle than that. It was as if the Emperor's presence, no longer needing to pretend at patience, simply split him into what he had been and what he had become. The light side Revan who remembered the Jedi, who remembered Bastilla, who still believed that people could be saved, and the dark side Revan who had walked in the unknown regions, who had felt the Emperor's hunger, who knew that some hungers could only be fed with everything you had. Both of them were real. Both of them were him. The Emperor in the Foundry spent centuries studying this split, the way a scholar might study the nature of something infinitely precious. And all the while, in the Republic and the Jedi Order beyond the unknown regions, centuries were passing as if time moved at a normal pace, unaware that in the deep dark places, time itself had become something the Emperor wielded like a weapon. I think about what it would be like to lose centuries that way, to have time not kill you quickly, but simply wear you down across a span so vast that you could feel yourself eroding grain by grain, and to know that the only other person who might have come to save you had made a choice, in her last moment, to believe in you even when the future said it was wrong. There is something about Revan's story at this point that feels less like a narrative of triumph and more like a meditation on what it costs to be loved by people who refuse to give up on you, even when hope itself has become something the darkness can corrupt. The galaxy outside, for now, had no idea that any of this was happening. 1,000 years of silence, and then, all at once, the silence breaks, not with a bang, but with the arrival of something that was never supposed to come back at all. To understand what happens now, you have to understand what happened very far away, in a place the Republic had nearly forgotten even existed. After the Great Hyperspace War, 5,000 years before this moment, the Sith Lords who survived the Jedi onslaught fled into the unknown regions, those vast stretches of uncharted space beyond the galaxy's edge, where navigation is uncertain and civilizations hide. They were refugees, in a way, though that word hardly captures the reality of it. They were the remnants of an empire that had reached across the galaxy and been shattered, and they carried with them the knowledge that survival now meant being invisible. One planet in particular called to them across the void, Drummond Cars, a world so remote and shrouded in perpetual darkness that even the Force seemed reluctant to touch it. A figure emerged among them, a Sith Lord whose name has echoed through centuries. Vitiate, though he was born on another world entirely, a place called Nathema, and that detail matters more than you might think. Young Vitiate, consumed by a hunger for immortality that most Sith Lords experience, but few ever truly act upon, performed a ritual on Nathema around the same time the Sith fled, a working of such devastating magnitude that it consumed not just the light of the planet itself, but the life of every living thing upon it. 8,000 Sith Lords died in that ritual, their power drained into him like a well running dry. The entire population of Nathema followed, their existence simply unmade. The world became a void, a place where the Force itself seemed to recoil, and what Vitiate gained was something close to what the Sith had always dreamed of, a kind of immortality, a fundamental alteration of his being that put him beyond the reach of age and ordinary death. He and the survivors who fled with him settled on Drummond Cars, and there, in the heart of that dark and storm-racked world, they rebuilt. It took time, more time than you might expect, even for immortals, because rebuilding an empire requires patience, discipline, the construction of infrastructure and hierarchy, and the careful cultivation of Force-sensitive bloodlines. For roughly 1,300 years, the Sith Empire grew in absolute secrecy, constructing warships and academies, training thousands of Force users, establishing a military apparatus and a bureaucracy as complex as anything the Republic had built. The Republic, meanwhile, went about the business of peace, secure in the belief that the Sith were gone, that the dark side had been scoured from the galaxy, that the Jedi Order's centuries of expansion and consolidation meant that darkness had finally, truly ended. The irony is almost gentle when you step back from it. While the Jedi were celebrating 1,000 years of golden light, the very thing they thought they had defeated was quietly gathering strength in the darkness beyond the galaxy's edge. I find myself thinking about what that must have felt like for the people who lived through it, the quiet certainty that the age of great conflicts had passed, that their children would inherit a safer galaxy than their parents had known. And then, in 3681, before the New Hope, in what must have felt like the sudden arrival of something from a dream nobody remembered having, the Sith Empire emerged from the unknown regions and attacked. It was not a tentative attack, a probe to test the Republic's defenses. It was a coordinated, devastating assault across multiple fronts in the Tinjal Arm and into the Outer Rim, fleets appearing in systems that had known peace for centuries, spreading conquest and shadow wherever they fell. The Republic was entirely unprepared, and that unpreparedness cascaded through those first years of what would come to be called the Great Galactic War. System after system fell or was threatened. The Jedi, who had grown comfortable in their role as peacekeepers and scholars rather than warriors, found themselves suddenly called to fight a kind of conflict they had believed resolved generations ago. And in the heart of the Sith Empire's renewed dominion sat the Emperor himself, vitiate, immeasurably ancient, and utterly committed to a vision of conquest that went deeper than mere military victory. A vision so dark that even the Dark Council that served him did not fully understand it. He led an empire structured around the old Sith tradition, a ruling caste of Force users, pureblood Sith and ambitious humans, supported by a vast military and countless enslaved species that did the work of building and maintaining power. Around him sat the Dark Council, 12 Sith Lords of tremendous power, including a figure named Darth Maul, who would come to embody the military will of the Empire, brilliant, brutal, committed to the conquest that his Emperor had set in motion. What none of them understood, what even the most perceptive among them could not perceive, was that Vitiate's true purpose had nothing to do with the conquest of the Republic, or even the domination of the galaxy as a political entity. He had spent centuries preparing for a ritual of such magnitude and darkness that it made even the consuming of Nathema seem like a rehearsal, a practice performance, a working that would allow him to consume not just a world or even an empire, but all life in the galaxy itself, to anchor his immortality not just in his own being, but in the absolute domination of everything that drew breath. The war was not the goal, it was the mechanism. That is the peculiar and unsettling truth about what was beginning. An entire galactic conflict, hundreds of thousands of deaths, the displacement of entire civilizations, all arranged as a prelude to something even darker still. The Jedi did not know this, and the Republic did not know this. They only knew that the peace they had inherited had shattered like glass, and that something vast and patient and utterly committed to darkness had finally opened its eyes. In those first years of conflict, as Republic forces scrambled to respond, and the Jedi called young knights to the temples for immediate deployment, nobody could have known that what they were fighting was not really a war of conquest in the traditional sense. It was a harvest. The Emperor gathered power not just through victory, but through every death, every moment of fear and despair and loss that rippled through the galaxy. And with each passing month and year, his terrible working grew closer to completion. But that is getting ahead of ourselves. For now, it was enough that the darkness had returned, that the thousand-year certainty of light had been shattered, and that the galaxy, which had thought itself at peace, had suddenly, irrevocably, been pulled back into war. Satel Shan was born into a name that carried weight, though for most of her childhood on Dantooine, she did not understand how much. Her master, Kausen Darach, recognized early that she had inherited something beyond typical Force sensitivity, a kind of clarity, a steadiness in the presence of chaos that suggested deeper bloodlines at work. It was not until the war came, in 3681, that anyone told her the truth, that her ancestor Bastila Shan had stood at the fulcrum of the Jedi Civil War nearly 3 centuries before, and that Bastila's bond with Revan, the fallen and redeemed general, had produced the lineage from which Satel herself descended. I find myself thinking about the weight of that revelation, the way she must have felt it, suddenly understanding that her very existence was woven from one of the great redemptions and tragedies of Jedi history. The Sith Empire returned in her lifetime, and as world after world fell to forces that should not have existed anymore, the question of who she was became inseparable from the question of what hope remained. Master Darach trained her in battle meditation, the same rare gift that Bastila had wielded, the ability to touch the minds of warriors in the heat of battle and steady them, to let them fight as if moving with a single shared purpose. It is one of the most intimate uses of the Force, not dominion, but communion, a joining of will that asks nothing of those touched, but allows them to become more fully themselves. When Khao Sen, Darach fell to the Sith in the opening years of the war, killed by enemies whose darkness he could not reason with, Seitel learned what it meant to carry a lineage not as inheritance, but as obligation. She was not yet fully trained, and the Order was fracturing. Worlds burning, Jedi scattered, the temple on Coruscant itself threatened. At the Battle of Alderaan, where the Sith brought their full might to bear against a Republic stronghold, Seitel stood with her battle meditation and held the line, lending her clarity to soldiers and fellow Jedi who were exhausted, afraid, and losing ground. She was young and uncertain of herself, but what she carried in her bloodline rose to meet the moment. Not power, precisely, but the capacity to believe in redemption even when surrounded by forces bent on absolute conquest. The Sith had been thought extinct for 1,000 years, erased from galactic memory by the victory at the Star Forge and all that had followed. The return of their empire from the unknown regions shattered that certainty and forced the Republic and the Jedi to reckon with a darkness that had never truly died, only waited and rebuilt itself in secret. Seitel did not know then that Revan, her ancestor, had been held captive all those centuries by the very Emperor whose forces now tore through the galaxy. That the man who unified Bastilla and created the Shan line had himself been trapped, studied, his very divided nature used as a template for domination. She only knew that the darkness was real, that it was vast, and that standing against it required not just strength, but grace. When the Sith attacked Coruscant itself, the Republic capital burned, and the Jedi Temple, the heart of the Order for generations, fell to the assault led by the Sith warrior Darth Malgus and his commanders. The destruction was deliberate and complete, a message that no sanctuary was safe, no tradition secure. In the aftermath, as negotiations for peace began, the surviving Jedi faced a terrible clarity. They had lost the war, even if they had not surrendered. The Treaty of Coruscant was signed in 3653, a desperate accommodation with an enemy that had proven too strong to defeat, too patient to be worn down by conventional means. Under its terms, the Sith retained vast, conquered territories, the Republic held its core worlds, and an uneasy armistice settled across the galaxy like frost. It was not peace, not truly. It was the acknowledgement that neither side could destroy the other, and that attempting to do so would cost everything remaining. And in that moment of exhaustion and grief, with the Jedi Temple in ruins and the Order scattered to their ancient homeworld of Tithon, Seitel Shan became something the galaxy desperately needed. A symbol that redemption was possible even in the presence of overwhelming darkness. She carried within her blood the names of those who had fallen to darkness and found their way back, Revan, Bastilla. And she had proven through the war that she carried also their capacity for compassion, for steadiness, for the belief that light could endure. The Jedi re-established themselves on Tithon, returning to the birthplace of their order, and Seitel took her place among those who would rebuild what had been broken. There is something profound in that choice to retreat not to despair, but to foundations, to the place where the Jedi had first gathered in balance and clarity. The Order had grown vast across 3 millennia, spreading across thousands of worlds, becoming comfortable in their apparent victory over the Sith. Now diminished and humbled, they returned to beginnings, and in that return, something essential was recovered. The memory that the Force itself is not the possession of any order, but a current that flows through all things, and that the Jedi's role is to align themselves with its deepest nature, not to dominate through it. In the archives of Tithon, as the Cold War that followed the treaty settled into a kind of exhausted watching, Seitel would sometimes encounter records of Revan, fragments of journals, testimony from those who had known him, the scattered history of a man who had been both the greatest threat the Jedi ever faced and the greatest redemption. And I think she understood, in the way you understand something that settles into your bones without needing to be spoken aloud, that she was not simply his descendant, but his continuation, not in darkness, but in the very capacity for transformation that had defined him. The Sith Emperor, hidden in his distant capital of Dromund Kars, would not forget the Shan bloodline, and in the years that followed, his attention would turn with particular weight toward this young woman whose ancestry contained the memory of his greatest failures. But in 3653, in the aftermath of the treaty, Satel Shan simply carried forward, teaching, learning, bearing witness to what had been lost, and holding in the depths of her being the quiet conviction that what had fallen could, someday, rise again, not in the form it once held, but transformed and deeper. There is hope in that kind of patience, the kind that does not demand immediate triumph, but trusts in the long turning of years. For 1,000 years, the Jedi had moved through the galaxy in a kind of peace, and they had done remarkable things in that time, built temples, trained countless Force sensitives, become counselors and peacekeepers to 10,000 worlds. They had grown large and visible and integral to everything the Republic was trying to become, and I think they had begun to believe, quietly, that the darkness had actually been defeated at last. It is a thought I understand, even if I know now that it cost them dearly. Then, in 3681 years before the New Hope, the hyperspace lanes from the unknown regions lit up with Sith warships, and that entire golden age came to an abrupt, terrible end. The Emperor, who called himself Vitiate but whose true name was Tenebrae, who had lived in hidden darkness for 13 centuries while the Jedi forgot he existed, had rebuilt his empire in absolute secrecy, and now he was coming home. Not to negotiate or coexist, but to conquer, to devastate, to restore what he believed had been stolen from him. The opening waves of the Imperial fleet struck not at the core, but at the edges, the outer rim and the Tingel arm, those scattered worlds that the Republic's attention had grown thin defending. And they did not strike gently. The Sith came in force so overwhelming that some worlds surrendered without resistance, simply because there was nothing anyone could do. The firepower that hung in orbit above them was sufficient to remake their continents, and the Sith made it clear, through demonstration, through patience, through examples of what happened when you chose defiance, that surrender was the only rational choice. There is a particular horror to a war that is not really a war, not in the classical sense, because one side has already decisively won before the fighting even begins, and the other side is simply trying to slow the inevitable. The Republic scrambled, and you have to understand what they were scrambling from, a belief so fundamental that it had shaped the entire direction of Jedi training for over 1,000 years, that the Sith were gone, extinct, erased from history. The very infrastructure of the Jedi Order was built around the assumption that the dark side had been defeated. Their temples had become centers of scholarship and meditation rather than fortresses. Their training had emphasized philosophy and balance rather than martial readiness. Their greatest teachers were architects and historians, not generals. And now they had to watch as that peaceful, beautiful order began to militarize in real time, watching their young people, the ones they had raised in peace, trained for peace, who had never expected to wage war, become soldiers overnight. The Sith Emperor did not move like a conqueror trying to hold territory. He moved like a hunter moving steadily through a forest, flushing his prey toward the center, and at the center was Coruscant itself, the Republic capital, the seat of the Jedi Temple. But he would take his time getting there. In the shadow of the main invasion, something else was happening that the Jedi could not quite see, not at first. A corruption from within, Sith agents moving through worlds they had long thought secure, turning governors and generals, poisoning the well of the Republic from the inside. The Mandalorians, those warrior clans whose culture had once drawn the young Jedi Revan into darkness, had been enlisted into the Emperor's cause, though whether by persuasion or by manipulation, by payment or by darker promises, the records do not quite say. They blockaded the Hydean Way, that greatest of hyperspace routes, the artery through which the Republic's supplies and reinforcements flowed to the embattled outer worlds. Cut off the supply lines, and you did not have to defeat an army in open battle. You could simply wait for them to starve. The war that had seemed so clear at first, here are the Sith, here is us, fight, became something far more complex. A choking, a strangling, a slow suffocation of the Republic's ability to respond. Sector by sector, the Sith conquered, or the Sith destroyed, or the Sith left nothing standing that could not be remade into an Imperial asset. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, moving like a thread through it, the Jedi Order began to break in ways that would not fully matter until much later. Because not all Jedi agreed that the war was being fought correctly. Not all believed that the Council's strategy of defense and holding ground was the right choice. Some, including a young Jedi Padawan named Satal Shan, who carried in her blood the legacy of Revan and Bastilla, and the possibility of redemption that legacy represented, began to argue for a more aggressive posture, for a willingness to strike first, to drive deeper, to match the Empire's ruthlessness with a righteous anger of their own. That argument, that fracture, would come to matter later, and it too was part of what the Emperor had set in motion, though not even he perhaps understood fully how. But in these early years, the visible war consumed everything. The rapid fall of world after world, the desperation of Republic fleets fighting enemies that seemed to have endless resources, the spreading sense that the peaceful centuries were not a permanent condition, but only a lull, and perhaps the lull was ending. What strikes me most about this moment, if I'm honest, is not the scale of the destruction or the speed of the conquest, though both were remarkable. It is the fact that the Emperor was not actually in a hurry. He had hidden for 1,300 years. He could afford to move methodically now. War that would eventually last nearly 30 years was not a blitzkrieg. It was a systematic dismantling of the Republic's ability to resist, wrapped inside the performance of conquest, a kind of cover for something far darker and older and stranger that was being prepared in secret, something that had nothing to do with holding territory or ruling space, and everything to do with the Emperor's personal immortality, his plan to consume the entire living galaxy as fuel for an eternal dominion. But that truth, that real purpose, would not become visible for many years. For now, there was only the war, the exhaustion, the loss, the creeping dread as world after world fell silent, and the Jedi, who had spent 1,000 years believing they had moved beyond such darkness, found themselves pulled backward into nightmare, unprepared and desperately trying to remember how to be warriors again. The Emperor's shadow had been growing for centuries, patient and inexorable, waiting for this moment. Now, finally, he had chosen to let it fall. And everything changed. There is a moment in the story of the galaxy when cruelty stops being something that happens to serve an aim and becomes instead an aim in itself. The Sith had waged war for years by the time they came to Alderaan, and in that span they had learned something about the Republic and its people that the Republic itself had not yet fully grasped, that the desire for peace, genuine and deeply felt, could be weaponized against you. Alderaan sat in the core worlds, one of the most ancient and storied of all Republic words, a place so synonymous with civilization and council that its very name carried the weight of centuries of diplomatic precedent. The noble houses of Alderaan, House Organa foremost among them, had spent generations building something rare in a galaxy perpetually at war. A culture of genuine pacifism, a belief that conflict could always be resolved through negotiation, that no disagreement was worth the cost of blood. The Sith came to Alderaan with an offer of peace, and Alderaan, being what it was, said yes. The Treaty of Coruscant was signed there in 3653 BBY, a desperate agreement meant to buy the Republic and the Jedi time to recover from the decimation of the sacking of Coruscant, a catastrophe that had occurred, in fact, while the treaty negotiations were happening at all. You see, the Sith negotiators had been delaying, speaking softly and at length, asking questions and entertaining counter-proposals, all while Darth Malgus and his strike team descended on Coruscant itself, breaching the Jedi Temple, putting the lightsaber to archives and masters alike. The negotiations were a curtain drawn across slaughter. When word reached Alderaan that the capital had fallen, that the temple had been sacked, that thousands of Jedi were dead or scattered, the treaty was already signed. The Republic accepted humiliating terms. The Sith would keep their conquered worlds, the Jedi would retreat, and the galaxy would accept that the dark side had returned and could not be defeated, only contained. There is something almost unbearably cruel about that, when you think about it, the way Alderaan's own virtue became the instrument of its destruction. But that destruction came later, after years had passed, after the Cold War that followed the treaty had torn Alderaan itself apart from within. The Sith had an appetite for discord, and they knew how to feed it. After the treaty, the royal line of Alderaan fell into chaos. The old succession was shattered, the throne vacant, the noble houses, House Organa, House Thull, House Ulgo, suddenly at each other's throats over who would rule and who would hold Alderaan's seat in the Republic Senate. The Sith poured fuel onto this fire, backing House Thull when it suited them, supporting Burris Ulgo when that created more discord, ensuring that the world that had stood for peace would tear itself to pieces in the name of power. And Alderaan, so devoted to the idea that all conflicts could be resolved through conversation and compromise, discovered that some voices speak only the language of darkness. The Alderaan civil war that followed was vicious in the way that civil conflicts always are, neighbor against neighbor, family against family, the certainty of righteousness on every side and blood on every street. The Killiks, an insectoid hive species that maintained colonies across Alderaan, became another faction in the struggle, their alien consciousness and agenda adding yet another layer of incomprehensibility to the conflict. Crown Prince Gaul Pantir died in the fighting, the last of the old royal line, and with him went any hope that Alderaan might simply restore the order that had been. The world was at war with itself, and the Sith watched and waited and observed. They were learning something, you see, during these years of the Cold War that followed the treaty. They were learning that a galaxy did not need to be conquered all at once by overwhelming force. It could be undone slowly, through the exploitation of its own desires. Its want for peace could be turned into passivity, its hope for survival into complicity. The Jedi had retreated to their homeworld of Tithon, licking their wounds and rebuilding, and the Republic had accepted the new order of things. There would be the Empire in the unknown regions, and there would be them. And between these powers, the galaxy would be divided and contested. But some powers understood that division was not the end goal, it was merely preparation. And then, at some point that the historical records are not entirely clear about, the Sith made a choice about Alderaan. Perhaps it was because the planet's symbol of peace had become unbearable to them, a constant implicit accusation that such a thing as peace was even possible. Perhaps it was because they had discovered something they wanted there, some artifact or installation of the ancient Rakata, or something else entirely. Perhaps it was simply because they could. What happened next is almost secondary to the fact that they did it. The Sith came to Alderaan not as conquerors, but as executioners, and they laid waste to the world in a deliberate and methodical fashion that suggested not military necessity, but something closer to ritual annihilation. The bombardment was total and without mercy. Cities burned, the apex mountains that had stood for 10,000 years were torn from the earth, the great estates of the noble houses were reduced to ash. The Killiks colonies were exterminated with particular thoroughness, as though the Sith wanted to erase even the memory that such a species had existed on the world at all. What the historians call the destruction of Alderaan is sometimes, in older records, referred to simply as the point at which the galaxy understood that the Sith would not be bound by any rules. This is what I find myself returning to again and again when I think about this period. Not the tactical outcome, but the message it sent. The Republic had hoped, in a way that was almost innocent, that there were limits to what the Sith would do. That they were dark, yes, but that the darkness served some purpose, some hunger that could be sated. The destruction of Alderaan was the Sith announcing that there were no such limits. That cruelty for its own sake was a perfectly valid expression of their philosophy. It was, in a sense, the moment the Jedi and the Republic understood they were not fighting an enemy with aims they could comprehend or negotiate with. They were fighting something that had decided, in its own estimation, that peace itself was an affront. And Alderaan, the peaceful world, the world of diplomats and noble houses and centuries of cultural refinement, became a cautionary tale whispered through the galaxy. This is what happens when you believe in the possibility of good faith negotiation with the absolute dark. There is a heaviness in that, a kind of exhaustion that settles over the whole of the story at this point. The age of the Jedi as healers and counselors and peacekeepers, the golden age that had lasted for centuries, was truly over now. What came after was something harder and colder and far less certain. Alderaan would be rebuilt, years later, by survivors and exiles who returned to a world of ash, but it would never be the same place it had been. And the Sith, having demonstrated that they recognized no boundaries, would consolidate that knowledge and use it in everything they did from that moment forward. In the early years of the war, before the Treaty of Coruscant, the Sith Emperor did something that had never been attempted in the recorded history of the Force. He reached out across the entire galaxy, not with words or armies, but with his will itself, and he tore. It is difficult to describe what happened, because it exists partly in the realm of the physical and partly in something beyond it, in the Force itself, which the Emperor had spent centuries learning to reshape as you might reshape clay. On Coruscant, in the great halls of the Jedi Temple, Masters and Padawans felt it at once. A sudden, violent rending, as though the ground beneath the entire spiritual order of the universe had given way. It was not pain exactly, though it was that too. It was the sensation of connection itself breaking, of the invisible web that bound the Jedi to the Force fraying and tearing open like paper. Hundreds of Jedi died in that moment, their consciousness scattered, their very souls torn from the foundation they had built themselves upon for thousands of years. The Jedi Temple, even as Darth Malgus's forces stormed its physical halls, became something else. A tomb filled with bodies that had no visible wounds, Jedi who had simply ceased to exist in any meaningful way. You must understand that the Jedi are not like other people. Their entire being is woven into the Force, as intimately as breath is woven into a living body. To tear the Force in their presence was, in some sense, to tear the Jedi themselves. The Emperor had learned this technique long ago, in a place called Nathema, in another ritual that had left an entire world as a void, empty of life, and the Force both. We have spoken before of that dark act. He had drawn thousands of Sith Lords to that world with the promise of power, and instead of sharing that power, he had consumed them entirely, fed on their life force, and in doing so burned all life from the world itself. Nathema became a kind of scar in the galaxy, a place where the Force itself seemed to recoil, unable to flow or thrive. But that ritual had been localized, contained to a single world, however catastrophic its effects. What the Emperor attempted during the sacking of Coruscant was something far more ambitious. He was learning to project that tearing, that void, across vast distances. He was learning, in a sense, to make the entire galaxy into something like Nathema. The Jedi Council sensed it immediately, not the physical attack on Coruscant, but the rupture in the Force itself, spreading outward like a wound through flesh. And in that moment, as they felt countless of their own kind simply vanish from the presence of the Force, the order that had endured for 25,000 years understood something that broke something fundamental in them. There was an enemy they could not fight with lightsaber or strategy. There was an enemy who had learned to unmake the very thing that made them Jedi. In the aftermath, when the survivors emerged from the ruins of the temple, and there were survivors, though not many, they found themselves changed. The Force felt different to them, damaged in a way that was hard to articulate, but impossible to ignore. It was as though the Emperor had not just killed Jedi. He had killed something in the Force itself, left a wound that would take years, perhaps generations, to fully heal. Satel Shan, standing amid the rubble with the last of the Order's defenders, felt it as a personal shattering. Her connection to the Force, which had always felt as natural and essential as her own breath, suddenly felt fragile, tenuous, as though it might be taken from her at any moment. And there was something else in that moment, something that would echo through the centuries to come. The Jedi realized they did not know what they faced. All the strategies, all the ancient knowledge, all the centuries of preparation, none of it had equipped them for an enemy who could remake reality itself according to his will. The Emperor, watching from Drummond cars, felt the ripples of his power spreading across the galaxy like rings in dark water. He had not been anywhere near Coruscant. He did not need to be. His presence stretched across the stars themselves, invisible and immense, a weight pressing down on everything. The ritual he had performed, the tearing of the Force, was not complete. It was only a beginning, a demonstration of what he could do when he chose to. And there was a purpose to this demonstration, beneath the obvious devastation. The Emperor was not simply trying to win a military war. He was reshaping the fundamental nature of what it meant to exist in a galaxy where the Force itself could be unmade at a will's command. He was teaching the Republic, the Jedi, the entire galaxy. Resistance was not merely futile, it was impossible. The very nature of reality could be rewritten by one who had sufficient will and preparation. The Treaty of Coruscant, signed just as the temple fell, was more than a political surrender. It was a concession to the law of a universe that the Emperor had just rewritten. In the chambers where the negotiators met, they did not speak of what had happened in the temple, not directly, not in words. But every Jedi present felt it as a weight upon their hearts, a knowledge that their order had been diminished in a way that no treaty, no military strategy could restore. When the Emperor was eventually confronted, centuries later, by those who had learned to resist him, they would discover that the tearing of the Force had been part of a larger pattern, a preparation for something even more terrible. But in this moment, at the signing of the treaty, all that remained was the simple, aching fact. The Jedi had endured for thousands of years, only to discover they were not as eternal as they had believed. The Emperor had shown them that even the Force itself could be wounded, and that knowledge, more than any military defeat, changed everything that followed. Corellia had always been the heart of something, not the Senate, not the temples, but the actual pulse of human civilization in the galaxy, the place where ships were born. The Corellian Engineering Corporation had built vessels there for more than 1,000 years, and in those shipyards and foundries, you could trace the DNA of the Republic itself. Coronet City rose in concentric rings from the spaceport, each tier a monument to prosperity, to the idea that humans could build something that lasted, something that mattered. When the Sith came, they came for that. By 3653, the war had been grinding on for nearly 3 decades, and Corellia had become what every core world was becoming, a fortress under siege, a place where the old peace was a memory so faint it barely counted as real. The Sith fleets descended on the system in waves, not the swift, decisive strikes that victory requires, but the methodical, suffocating pressure of an enemy that knows time is on its side. Republic admirals who had spent their careers managing trade disputes and colony logistics found themselves trying to hold a line against commanders who had been waging war for 3,000 years. The disparity was not just in numbers or firepower, though the Empire had those in abundance. It was in patience, in the willingness to absorb losses that would have crippled any conventional military. There's something that happens to a world when you realize it is going to be fought over until it breaks. It's not the fighting itself, not really. It's the knowledge that no position is final, that every hill taken will be contested again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. The people of Coronet understood this by the time the Sith began their assault in earnest. The Jedi came, as they always did, and they fought as they always did, and they were magnificent and insufficient, which is perhaps the cruelest combination there is. Satel Shan may have been among them. The records blur in this period, as so many records do when worlds are falling, and the Jedi are learning that their power has limits it had not known it possessed. What we know is that Republic forces held sections of the orbital lanes, that Sith starfighters descended through the atmosphere like a plague of locusts, that the shipyards that had once produced the vessels of peace now became fortified positions in a grinding war of attrition. And we know that neither side could hold it. This is the thing about Corellia that stays with me. It was not a decisive victory for anyone. The Republic did not drive the Sith back into the unknown regions. The Sith did not overwhelm the defenses and claim a trophy world for their growing empire. Instead, both sides bled there until something that looked like exhaustion settled over both of them. The Sith, for all their patience and dark ambition, were not infinite either. They had resource limits, supply lines that stretched across hostile space, commanders who could be killed. The Republic, for all its desperate courage, could not match the Sith's willingness to absorb casualties as the cost of forward momentum. What emerged from Corellia was not victory, but a kind of stalemate, the recognition that the war would not be won through the methods either side had been trying. I think about what that moment cost, not in credits or ships or lives, though it cost all of those, but in the certainty that both sides had carried into the conflict. The Sith had emerged from 13 centuries of hidden preparation, believing themselves unstoppable. They had conquered the Outer Rim in methodical waves, shattered the Jedi Temple itself, and torn open the Force in ways that no one alive had thought possible. But Corellia taught them that the core worlds were a different proposition, that humans who fought for their homeworlds fought with a ferocity that the Empire had not quite anticipated. For the Republic, the lesson was harder still, that no amount of courage or righteousness was going to be enough to drive back an enemy that had had 3,000 years to prepare and was willing to spend 3,000 more. Within months of the stalemate at Corellia, the Treaty of Coruscant would be signed, an agreement that neither side wanted, but both sides had come to recognize as inevitable. The war would end, but it would not end the way wars are supposed to end, with one side victorious and the other in retreat. It would end because both sides had finally understood that the other side could not be broken, and in understanding that, both sides stepped back from the brink. There is no victory in this moment. There is only the exhaustion that comes from trying to move an immovable object. The shipyards of Corellia survived, though they were scarred and diminished, their capacity for wonder temporarily burned away by the collision of two civilizations that could not destroy each other. The Jedi retreated to Tithon to rebuild their temples and their faith in a force that had revealed itself to be less protective than they had believed. And the Sith, patient as always, stepped back into the shadows to consider what had not gone according to plan and what might work better. This is often how the most consequential moments arrive, not as clear victories or defining defeats, but as pauses, as the moment when both combatants finally understand that the cost of continuing will exceed any possible gain. Corellia held the line, and in holding it, it changed the shape of everything that came after. Not because holding the line won the war, but because it made clear that the war, as currently being waged, could not be won. That recognition, quiet and exhausted, and without fanfare, was perhaps the most important moment of the entire conflict. In the 28th year of the Great Galactic War, something shifted in the exhaustion of both sides. and what shifted was the possibility that neither could truly win. The Sith Empire, for all its preparation across 13 centuries in the unknown regions, for all the terrifying patience of the Emperor Vitiate himself, had not swept through the Republic as its architects had perhaps imagined it might. The Republic, meanwhile, had not collapsed, had not surrendered its faith or its will, despite the sacking of Coruscant, despite the spiritual wound carved through the Force itself when the Emperor tore the fabric between worlds. What happened instead was something quieter and perhaps more significant. Both civilizations simply became exhausted. You understand this, I think, if you have ever been in a room with another person and realized that neither of you has the energy left to keep fighting, and so you stop, not because one of you has won, but because the cost of continuing has become too high to measure. That is where the galaxy stood in 3653 BBY. For 28 years, the Sith had conquered methodically through the Outer Rim and Tingel Arm, their ships emerging from the unknown regions with weapons and strategies the Republic could not have anticipated. For 28 years, the Republic had defended, ceded, regrouped, held lines at Corellia and Alderaan and Tithon itself, losing worlds and young people and faith in their own permanence. The negotiators who sat down to discuss the Treaty of Coruscant did so not as victors or even as reasonable equals, but as people who had looked across a table long enough to understand that the table itself might collapse if they did not both step back. But there is something you must hold carefully here, because the Sith negotiators who arrived at those talks had not come seeking genuine peace. They had come with the Emperor's blessing and the Emperor's strategy to consolidate. The Great Galactic War was not ending because the Empire had lost its hunger, or because the Republic had found some secret strength that pushed the Sith back across the star lines from which they had emerged. It was ending because the Sith had accomplished what they meant to accomplish in this opening phase, and the treaty itself was the next move, the next calculated step in a game that had never truly paused. On the steps of the ruined Jedi Temple on Coruscant, Darth Malgus, a Sith Lord of terrible power and terrible certainty, had proclaimed that a new day was dawning, that the Republic was not eternal, that the age of the Jedi was closing. Those words were not victory rhetoric, though they sounded like it. They were prophecy, spoken by someone who knew what was coming next. The temple itself, that ancient sanctum where the Jedi Order had gathered for centuries, where younglings had been trained and masters had meditated on the balance between attachment and duty, was in ruins. Not completely destroyed, no. The Republic was still strong enough to hold the capital, to retake it from Sith occupation, but ruined enough that the message was unmistakable. Nowhere was safe, nothing was permanent, and the Jedi themselves could be wounded in ways they had perhaps believed impossible. The Republic's negotiators sat down at the treaty table with Coruscant itself under threat, the bombardment capable of resuming at the Empire's word, the capital city hostage to whatever terms the Sith would demand. And so they yielded. They ceded entire regions of the Outer Rim, worlds the Republic had held or contended for, populations it had said it would protect. They recognized the sovereignty of the Sith Empire, which meant acknowledging that a second legitimately governing power now existed in the galaxy, that the Republic was not the only player in this game, that there was territory it would not reach and peoples it would not save. They withdrew forces from contested worlds, pulling the naval presence back from the edges of the Sith sphere of influence, drawing the boundaries of safety inward toward the core. I find myself thinking about the people in those negotiating chambers, trying to choose between unbearable options. There were Republic senators there, diplomats who had believed in the Republic's resilience, who had perhaps even believed that reason and negotiation were their native languages. There were Jedi, including young Satal Shan, who had fought and meditated and given everything she had, and who now was being asked to accept terms that felt like surrender. There was the strain between those who believed the Jedi should have fought harder, that the Order had failed the Republic, and those who understood that the Jedi could not have done anything differently, that they had faced something older and more patient and more fundamentally dark than anything they had confronted before. The relationship between the Jedi Order and the Galactic Republic fractured in those negotiations, subtly but permanently. Trust does not recover easily from the sensation of having been abandoned, and the Republic would carry that wound for years afterward. When the Treaty of Coruscant was signed, when the documents were sealed, and the terms became the new reality of galactic politics, the Jedi Order made a choice that was also a retreat. They abandoned Coruscant, the heart of their institutional power for centuries, and departed for Tithon, their ancient homeworld in the deep core, the planet where the first Jedi had gathered 25,000 years before, learning to balance the Force with each other rather than against it. There was a terrible irony in that journey, and I think the Jedi felt it even as they made it. They were returning to the beginning because the present had become unsustainable. They were going back to the source not as a pilgrimage, but as a retreat, and there is a difference between choosing to revisit the root of your faith and being forced back to it by the collapse of everything built on that route. In the hidden depths of Drummond Cars, on the hidden world where the Sith Emperor ruled from chambers no outsider had ever seen, Vitiate received word that the treaty had been signed. The war had not ended, you understand. It had merely changed shape. The Cold War, as historians would later call it, began in that moment, a stalemate of surveillance and shadow operations and proxy conflicts that would last approximately a decade before open hostilities resumed. But in those 10 years, both sides would consolidate in different ways. The Republic would rebuild its wounded temple, nurse its injured Jedi, try to restore the confidence of worlds that no longer believed it could protect them. The Sith, meanwhile, would integrate the conquered territories into their expanding infrastructure, prepare the Emperor's grand designs, study in deeper secrecy the rituals and technologies that would allow Vitiate to achieve something no ruler had ever achieved before: true and absolute immortality through the consumption of all life itself. The treaty was not peace. It was a pause, a moment where two exhausted powers stepped back from each other, both still breathing, both still dangerous, both already planning what they would do when they resumed. And the most terrible part, perhaps, is that only one side knew this was the plan. The Sith had always known. The Sith, with their 1,000-year patience, their systematic preparation, their emperor who could live for centuries and wait with the certainty of someone who had already seen the future. They knew that this treaty, this apparent defeat, was actually the completion of one phase and the beginning of the next. The Republic did not know this. The Republic believed it had negotiated a breathing space, had bought time to recover and rebuild. The Republic hoped for peace. And that asymmetry, that one side understood the war had never truly paused, while the other believed they could rest, would shape everything that followed. There is something almost unbearable in that, if you sit with it long enough. The cruelty is not in the force of the conquest, but in the quiet knowledge that the conquered believed something they should not have believed. That is the Sith way, I suppose. Always the long deception, always the patient lie, always the plan that unfolds across decades, because the planner understands that true power is not in the moment of striking, but in the time you have already stolen from your enemy while they believed themselves safe. In the aftermath of the Treaty of Coruscant, when the exhausted Republic had accepted what it believed to be an uneasy peace, the man known as the Sith Emperor stood alone in the highest chamber of his fortress on Drummond Cars, in the unknown regions, far from the eyes of both Republic and Jedi. He had waited so long for this moment, not the treaty itself, which was merely a tool, but the world's consent to believe the danger had passed. For centuries, through the patient reconstruction of his hidden empire, through the slow gathering of power and the cultivation of his dark council, he had prepared for exactly this, the moment when the galaxy would lower its guard and open itself to him. You have to understand what immortality actually means in the way Vitiate understood it. It is not simply the absence of death. It is the achievement of will so complete, so absolute, that the very structure of existence bends to accommodate it. Vitiate had been born on the red world of Medriars around 5,000 years before this moment, the child of a Sith Lord named Dramath and a slave woman with no name that history remembered. Even as a boy, his power in the dark side was monstrous, uncontainable. He killed his father's rivals with a thought, dominated the minds of those around him as casually as breathing, and when his half-brother stood in the way of his ambition, he erased him from existence. He was not trained in the way Sith Lords usually are. He simply woke up one day, knowing how to consume. By the time he was old enough to rule Medriars outright, taking the name Vitiate as his own, he had already begun to dream of something far larger than a single world. Around 4,800 years before the treaty, when he was still young by the standards of one who had begun to touch immortality's edges, Vitiate gathered beneath his fortress on Nathema, the old name for Medriars, a vast ritual circle. He summoned 8,000 Sith Lords to his world under the pretense of war, of conquest, of the final triumph over the Republic. They came because they believed in victory, or because they believed in him, or because they had no real choice in the matter. And on a night that lasted longer than any night should, Vitiate performed a ritual that had no name and would never be performed again. I have tried over the years to find the right words for what happened in that moment, and I have not found them. What I can tell you is this: he did not kill them, not in the way killing is ordinarily understood. He consumed them. He drank their life force, their power, their consciousness, everything they were, down into himself like a man drinking from an endless well. 8,000 Sith Lords, their accumulated knowledge, their strength in the dark side, the essence of what they had built across generations, all of it flowed into Vitiate and was unmade in the process. And it was not enough. The hunger was still there, insatiable, reaching outward. The ritual did not stop when the last Sith Lord fell. It spread across the world itself. Every living thing on Nathema, the animals, the plants, the insects, the very microorganisms in the soil, all of it was consumed and burned away in the service of Vitiate's apotheosis. When it was finished, Nathema was empty. Not destroyed in the way a planetary bombardment destroys, with ruins and craters and the traces of what was. Empty. A husk. A void where the Force itself recoiled. When Force sensitives would later come close to Nathema, they would feel as though they were standing at the edge of nothing, as though the world had been scooped clean of all spiritual resonance and left to echo with the memory of absence. And Vitiate, in that moment, became something that had no precedent in the galaxy. He became immortal, not in the way of legend or artifact or ritual that extends life a few centuries or 1,000 years. He became immortal in the way a god might be immortal, with the ability to transfer his consciousness from body to body, to inhabit vessels of his choosing, to persist indefinitely as long as the will to persist remained strong. The universe had given him what he desired, the knowledge that he could consume anything, and that in consuming it, he could sustain himself forever. In the years that followed, the Sith Emperor rebuilt his empire piece by piece, slowly, in the darkness of the unknown regions where neither Republic probe nor Jedi scout could find him. He established his throne on Dromund Kars, a world dark with ancient forests and deep oceans, and from there he ruled through a dark council, 12 other Sith Lords who believed themselves to be the highest authority in their order. They were not. They never were. Vitiate allowed them to believe they governed because it amused him, or perhaps because even a god finds it useful to have intermediaries, people to absorb the small frictions of command, while the true center of power remained aloof and absolute. He kept his true existence secret from all but a few of his closest servants. Most of the Sith under his rule knew him only as a distant, godlike presence, a voice that came from the darkness, a consciousness that moved through their ranks like wind through leaves. Some of them believed he was not even a single being at all, but rather the will of the dark side itself made manifest. And in a way, that was closer to the truth than any official doctrine the Empire maintained. Through the decades following the treaty, while the Republic rebuilt its shattered Jedi Order on Tithon, while Satal Shan trained in the gift of battle meditation, and the Jedi tried to heal the wound the Emperor had carved through their connection to the Force, Vitiate worked on his true design. The war, the conquest, the treaty itself, all of it was merely prologue. What he was actually preparing for was a ritual that would complete what he had begun on Nathema, but on a galactic scale. To consume not 8,000 Sith Lords, but all life in the galaxy. To leave nothing standing but himself. To achieve, at last, the condition of solitary godhood that had always been his desire. He could be patient for this, because patience was something he had already learned in eternity. He had killed his father, his brother, 8,000 Sith, an entire world. What was a galaxy compared to that? What was 1,000 years? The Emperor stood in his chamber on Drummond cars and felt the cold satisfaction of absolute certainty, the knowledge that beneath the surface of the treaty, beneath the relief of the Republic and the cautious optimism of the Jedi, he was still moving toward his appointed end. The galaxy believed itself safe now. It was wrong. It had only learned to stop looking in the right direction. And by the time it turned its attention back to the darkness, it would be far too late to stop what he had already begun. After decades of Cold War and hidden preparation, there comes a moment when the darkness finally reveals its hand, and the Jedi understand at last what they have been facing. The Emperor's true plan, the one hidden beneath conquest and territory and the endless negotiation of treaties, emerges piece by piece, whispered through interrogations of captured Sith, through visions that wake young Jedi in the night, through the slow piecing together of fragments that were never meant to connect. It is the plan to repeat what he did to Nathema, but on a scale that encompasses every world, every mind, every spark of consciousness in the known galaxy. To consume all life, and in that consumption, achieve godhood. There is something in that detail that strips away every other consideration. Not conquest, not rule, not even vengeance, but absolute annihilation in service of his own immortal elevation. The Jedi who first fully grasped this, Satal Shan among them, now a master carrying the same will to endure that ran through Revan's centuries before, felt the weight of it settle like a stone in their chest. This is not a war that can be won through negotiation, or through compromise, or through simply holding the line long enough for exhaustion to set in. This is a war against someone whose patience is measured in centuries, and whose ambition is nothing less than the unmade reality itself. The Emperor's weakness, when the Jedi finally uncover it, comes not from espionage or from the turning of his own servants, but from a truth so fundamental it had always been there, waiting. Vitiate had anchored himself to the galaxy through a ritual so dark, so consuming, that it had made him nearly impossible to kill through conventional means. He could transfer his consciousness between bodies, between vessels he called his voices, and so long as even one of them remained, he remained. But that anchoring also made him singular in the Force. In a way, nothing else had ever been singular. His presence was felt everywhere, because he was stretched across everything, like a thread of absolute shadow running through the fabric of the galaxy itself. And if one thread could be severed cleanly enough, if one anchor point could be destroyed with sufficient precision, the entire architecture might collapse. A young Jedi Knight, raised in the traditions of Tithon and trained in the ways Satal Shan had passed down, discovered this truth almost by accident, and in discovering it, became something the Emperor had not expected. A vessel that could not be possessed, a consciousness that had looked into the darkness and chosen to remain itself. Around this Jedi, others began to gather, not out of desperate hope, but out of a different kind of hope, the kind that comes from understanding that the darkness, for all its reach, had a seam, a weakness, a place where it could be cut. Lord Scourge, a Sith whose faith in the Emperor had fractured when he glimpsed the truth of what Vitiate intended, chose in that moment to betray his own order. It is easy to miss the significance of that choice, buried as it is beneath the immediacy of what comes next, but it matters. A creature of darkness, raised in the shadows of Korriban and the absolute hierarchy of the Empire, looked at the light and decided that some things, some truths, were worth the price of damnation. Kira Carson, a young woman who had been born a child of the Emperor, possessed and used as his puppet until she was rescued and taught to be herself again, carried within her a knowledge of his methods that no one else possessed. She knew the shape of his presence, the feel of his will pressing against consciousness, and she knew too that it could be resisted, that self was not something that could be wholly consumed if it was protected with sufficient care and intention. The companions who had fought beside the Jedi Knight through the Cold War began to understand, in those final days before the preparation for confrontation, what they were actually being asked to do. Not to win a war in the conventional sense, but to strike at the root of an immortal evil that had planned, waited, and orchestrated with such patience that it had taken centuries for the Jedi simply to recognize what they were facing. The preparations were methodical and quiet, without fanfare or reassurance. There was no guarantee of success, and everyone involved understood this with perfect clarity. The Jedi Council, meeting in secret on Tithon, spoke about contingencies, about what would be left if this failed, about whether the Order could rebuild a third time if the darkness consumed the attempt. Yet underneath that practical discussion lay something else, a recognition that some moments are not about probability or survivability, but about necessity, about the simple fact that certain things must be attempted because the alternative, doing nothing while an immortal evil completed its design, was itself a kind of death. On Drummond cars, in the vast throne room where the Emperor held court, and where the Dark Council convened in the shadow of his presence, the Jedi Knight and his companions prepared to enter the place where Vitiate had lived and ruled for longer than the Republic had existed. It was not a journey undertaken with certainty, but with the quiet understanding that comes from having looked into an abyss and deciding, nonetheless, to cross it. The Emperor, from his throne of absolute darkness, felt the approach of something that did not fear him, and for the first time in centuries, something in his ancient consciousness stirred that might have resembled concern. He had waited so long, planned so carefully, and now, at the threshold of apotheosis, there came a light that insisted on meeting him not in negotiation, but in absolute, final confrontation. Satel Shan, watching from Tithon through the Force itself, sent her strength across the galaxy to the Knight who carried the hope of the Order, and in that moment, the long age of the Cold War ended. What comes next is the reason all of this was endured. Not victory, not survival, but the simple, necessary act of striking back at the absolute dark with every light that the galaxy still possessed. The stage is set, the players are in place, and the final hour approaches not with fanfare or announcement, but with the quiet certainty of something that must now, finally, come to pass. Tonight, I want to tell you about the last battle against the Emperor, the moment when everything the Jedi and Republic had rebuilt seemed finally, impossibly to end. Tonight, I want to tell you about the long silence that followed, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a world that has learned to breathe again, unaware of what waits in the darkness beyond its sight. After the Battle of Ruusan and the Thought Bomb's terrible bloom, after Lord Hoth's army of light had claimed the field, and Lord Khan's Brotherhood of Darkness lay shattered in the dust, the Jedi Order looked up and saw a galaxy at peace. It is a strange thing to inherit victory so complete that it erases the very notion of future threat, to stand in the light of what you have won and mistake that light for permanence. The Republic, which had fought for its survival across decades of bitter war, began the slow work of mending itself. Worlds that had burned began to rebuild. Trade routes that had fallen silent hummed again with commerce and life. The Rusan Reformation restructured the Republic's military, pulling back its standing armies and redistributing power across planetary governors and sector fleets, trusting that the greater peace would hold without constant martial readiness. This was not cynicism, you understand. It was hope, and there is a kind of wisdom in choosing to believe in peace once you have fought so hard for it. The Jedi Order, which had stood as warriors and generals for generations, began to remember what it meant to be something else. Scholars and counselors, keepers of wisdom rather than commanders of armies. They established temples and enclaves across thousands of worlds, moving from war footing into a slower, steadier purpose, their hand on the Republic's shoulder less as a military force than as a guide. I think there is something almost tender in how they approached this. The Jedi entering what would become their golden age, building libraries and meditation halls, taking in students from every corner of the galaxy, refining their understanding of the Force across centuries of uninterrupted study. The Order grew vast and luminous during this time, touching more lives, reaching deeper into the galaxy than it had ever done before. And by any measure of peace and scholarship and the expansion of light, it was magnificent. Yet underneath this brightness, in the places where no Jedi eye could reach, something else was also growing. Something that had learned patience the way the Jedi had learned peace. One Sith had survived the thought bomb on Rusan. A man named Dissel, once a Cortosis miner, who had become Darth Bane, who had orchestrated the Brotherhood's destruction from within because he understood something that the other Sith Lords had never grasped. That their hunger for power, unrestrained and collective, was itself the engine of their extinction. Bane had foreseen the thought bomb, had positioned himself at the edge of its radius, had allowed it to consume his brothers and rivals so that he alone might stand in the aftermath. And from that solitude, he crafted something new. He took a single apprentice, a young Sith survivor named Zana, and he taught her the rule of two, the principle that there would never again be legions of Sith Lords fighting each other for supremacy, but only ever a master and an apprentice, bound in the oldest relationship of power. I teach you, and one day you will be strong enough to kill me, and then you will teach another, and on, across the centuries. There is something almost elegant about this architecture of darkness. The recognition that the Sith's self-destruction came not from weakness, but from numbers, not from too little ambition, but from too much ambition untempered by structure. The rule of two was designed to select, ruthlessly and methodically, for strength across generations, each apprentice tested against a master, each master proven by the fact that they had survived their own apprentice's hunger. Bane took Zana to Korriban, the ancient Sith homeworld, hidden in the unknown regions, and there he began to build something that the Jedi would never see. A shadow Sith order, invisible even to the Force-sensitive eye, growing in patience while the Jedi expanded in peace. The thousand-year silence was not silence at all. It was a heartbeat, steady and hidden, the pulse of something waiting. For 1,000 years, as the Jedi built temples and trained new generations, the Sith passed from master to apprentice in secret, each one more disciplined, more patient, more willing to wait than the last. The rule of two meant that conquest could not happen quickly. Two people cannot conquer a galaxy by force of arms alone. So the Sith learned to work differently, from within systems, through manipulation and corruption, with a patience that measured progress in decades and centuries rather than years. It was a fundamentally different calculus from anything the galaxy had known. The Brotherhood of Darkness had wanted everything immediately, had waged open war, had seen the Jedi as enemies to be destroyed in direct confrontation. The rule of two wanted permanence, and permanence required that your enemies never suspect you existed at all. The Jedi of this golden age, and I do not say this without genuine warmth, were beautiful in their hope and their learning and their belief that the galaxy had turned toward the light forever. They did not know, and could not have known, that they were also the harvest that was being cultivated in darkness. Every young Jedi they trained, every world they brought into the light, every decade of peace that made them more necessary and more deeply woven into the fabric of the Republic, all of it would become, eventually, leverage and weapon and fuel. There is a particular kind of ache in knowing the before and after, in understanding that the Jedi's greatest strength during these 1,000 years, their genuine dedication to peace and learning and service, was precisely what would make them vulnerable when the darkness finally came. They had become comfortable in their righteousness. They had forgotten, perhaps, that the Force itself contains both light and shadow, that balance is not permanent, that the universe does not belong to either side by right. But that is not the story of this chapter. This chapter is about the peace itself, the real and genuine centuries of quiet that followed Ruusan, the expansion of the Jedi Order and the healing of the Republic, the slow work of building something that would last, or so they believed. Master and apprentice moved through the shadows of the galaxy, unknown and invisible, each one teaching the next, each generation growing more disciplined and more certain of a distant victory that was as yet invisible even to them. The darkness did not rage or roar or announce itself. It simply waited, with the infinite patience of something that knew it had 1,000 years ahead of it, and that was more than enough. And the Jedi, in their golden age, continued their work in the light, never knowing that somewhere in the silence, their opposite number was also at work, learning, growing, preparing for a return that would not come for centuries yet, but would come nonetheless. This is the long silence before the night. A peace so complete it seemed permanent, and a darkness so patient it seemed not to exist at all.